The wind that howls across the Mongolian steppe is ancient. It whispers of hooves pounding the earth, of warriors clad in furs and iron, of tribes locked in bitter feuds that last generations. Long before the world knew the name Genghis Khan, this land was already a crucible of survival, harsh, merciless, and yet endlessly vital. It was a world that did not permit weakness, where alliances were fleeting, and betrayal was as common as the biting wind. Into this world unforgiving and raw, a child was born who would one day transform the world more than any man before or after. The Mongolian plateau in the 12th century was a vast expanse of grasslands, forests, rivers, and deserts. It was a world divided not by national borders but by bloodlines, totems, and the invisible boundaries of shifting alliances. The Mongols themselves were not a unified people, but a patchwork of clans and tribes. The Taishird, Kurite, the Naiman, the Merkit, and the Tatars among others. Each group had its own leaders, rivalries, and customs. And yet they all lived under the same open sky, worshipped the eternal blue heaven, Tengri, and lived by the horse. Horses were everything to the steppe nomads. Children learned to ride before they could walk steadily. A Mongol warrior might carry 3 to 5 mounts during a campaign, switching from one to another to keep his animals fresh. They drank the blood of their horses in emergencies and milked their mares daily. To the settled civilizations beyond the steppe, the Chinese to the south, the Persians to the west, these people seemed like demons on horseback, appearing from the wilderness in sudden storms and vanishing just as quickly. But despite the romanticized image of the free-riding nomad, the truth was far grimmer. Life on the steppe was short, brutal, and dictated by necessity. Tribes raided one another not out of wanton savagery but for survival. For cattle, women, salt, and land, power was everything. And power changed hands quickly. In this world, leadership was not inherited by default. While lineage played a role, a leader needed to prove himself constantly through strength, charisma, cunning, and the ability to maintain loyalty, often by force. If a Khan showed weakness, his men might abandon him or even kill him. The steppe had no room for sentimentality. Mercy was rare. Vengeance, on the other hand, was a sacred duty. The political landscape was constantly shifting. The Yuan Dynasty in northern China played a dangerous game of diplomacy, supporting one steppe clan over another to maintain control over its volatile northern border. Gold, silk, and titles were exchanged for loyalty, until loyalty changed. In the west, the Karakay Empire held sway over Central Asia, watching the Mongol lands with suspicion. To the south, the great Tangut Kingdom of Western Xia stood as a powerful intermediary between the desert and the Chinese heartland. Into this brutal, fractured, and unstable world came a man named Yasuge, chief of the Borjigin clan, a relatively small Mongol tribe. He was a descendant of Badanchur Munkhag, a semi-mythical warlord whom the Borjigin revered as their founder. Yasuge was known for his strength in battle, his cunning, and his ambition. He had forged alliances with neighboring clans and fought the powerful Tatars, earning a name among the steppe chieftains. His wife Holin was no ordinary woman either. She had been stolen from her original husband by Yasuge, as was common in steppe tradition, but she remained fiercely loyal and formidable in character. It was to this pair that a boy was born around the year 1162 near the Anan River. They named him Temujin. After a Tatar warrior Yasuge had just defeated in battle, the name was not chosen for honor, but for domination. A reminder that from the moment of his birth, Temujin was part of the great game of blood and conquest. No astrologers predicted greatness. No omens appeared in the sky, yet this child born into a tiny and fractured tribe would go on to forge the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Temujin's early life would be defined not by luxury, but by exile, betrayal, and survival. Before he could rise, he would have to be broken. The Mongol world did not give freely. It demanded everything. And in return, it offered only one reward: power. Temujin's first memories were not of warmth or peace. He was not raised in a royal yurt, cradled in silk, or treated as a child destined for greatness. His life began on the edge of a knife, and it would remain there for years. When he was around 9 years old, his father, Yasuge, took him on a journey to arrange a marriage alliance. On the steppes, such decisions were made early, and Yasuge sought to secure his son's future through ties to the influential Anjarat tribe. They reached the camp of Genghis Khan, a respected leader, whose daughter Bert was offered as Temujin's future bride. The agreement was sealed, and Temujin was left with the Anjarat to live and learn among his future in-laws, a normal practice at the time. But as fate would have it, Temujin's life was about to collapse. Yasuge, returning home alone, encountered a group of Tatars, longtime enemies of the Borgajin, and made the fatal mistake of accepting their hospitality without revealing his identity. They poisoned his food. Yasuge died not long after returning home. With his father dead, Temujin's world was torn apart. His family, his mother Holin, and several younger siblings, were immediately cast out by the rest of the Borjigin clan. On the steppe, a tribe without a strong male leader was a liability, not a kinship to be protected. Their camp was abandoned. Their livestock was taken. They were left with nothing. For years, Temujin's family survived in the wilderness like wild animals. They dug up roots, they caught fish and hunted rats. Holin, a woman of incredible willpower, kept them alive, not just through skill, but through sheer determination. She taught her sons resilience and unity, even as they sometimes turned on one another. Temujin's relationship with his half-brother Begder soured as they grew older. Begder, being older, attempted to assert dominance over the family, claiming the right to marry one of Holin's widowed daughters, law, which in Mongol custom would have elevated his authority. Temujin, viewing this as a threat to his own standing, took decisive and brutal action. Along with his younger brother Kasar, he ambushed Begder and killed him. This act, fratricide, was both taboo and a survival tactic. It underscored Temujin's ruthless streak and his instinct for preserving power even in boyhood. It also branded him as dangerous, and this reputation would follow him into adulthood. Still a teenager, Temujin now stood at the edge of adulthood with blood on his hands. But no tribe, no power, and no path forward. Then came another blow. He was captured by the Teashird, a rival Mongol clan who had once followed his father. With Yasuge gone, they saw Temujin not as a potential ally, but a threat. He was taken prisoner and shackled with a wooden collar, a sign of humiliation. He was held like a dog, paraded as an example to other clans of what happened to those who overreached. But Temujin never surrendered to fate. He watched. He waited. He noted the weaknesses of his captors, their routines, the layout of their camps, and one night, when an opportunity arose, he escaped. With the help of a sympathetic guard who would later serve him, he vanished into the wilderness again, scarred but unbroken. Each trial hardened him. Each betrayal taught him. Each humiliation steeled his resolve. Over the following years, Temujin began to rebuild. He reconnected with old allies of his father, forming tight, loyal bonds not based on blood, but trust. This was revolutionary. In the steppes tribal culture, loyalty had always been tied to kinship, but Temujin offered something new, a place in a meritocratic brotherhood. One of the most important of these allies was a young warrior named Jamuchin's blood brother. The two shared dreams of greatness. But while Jamuka remained loyal to traditional steppe aristocracy, Temujin saw the value in breaking the old order. He recruited from the lower classes, even from slaves and orphans, offering them honor and a place in his future vision. Temujin was also reunited with Bert, the girl he had been promised 2 years earlier. Their marriage rekindled his claim to legitimacy and brought him the support of the Anjarat. But tragedy soon followed. Bert was kidnapped by the Merket, a rival clan that had long feuded with the Borjigin. Temujin rallied what few followers he had, including his blood brother Jamuka and an important ally named Togrul, the Khan of the Karat tribe. Together, they launched a rescue mission and crushed the Merket. Bert was recovered. Not long after, she gave birth to a son, Joki, but the paternity of the child remained a question mark. As Bert had been held by the Merkets for months, still, Temujin accepted Joki as his own, a decision that would have immense implications for the future of the empire. Temujin's rise from exile to tribal leader was neither easy nor assured. He had no noble backing, no great army, and no lands. All he had was resilience, charisma, a growing band of fiercely loyal warriors, and a mind that had already begun to see the world differently. He didn't just want revenge. He wanted transformation. He wanted more than the steppes. He wanted the world. Why his early 20s? Temujin was no longer just a survivor. He was becoming a symbol. Among the scattered and war-weary Mongol tribes, he stood out as something new, a leader not tied to noble bloodlines, but to merit. A man who rewarded loyalty, punished treachery without hesitation, and most importantly, offered opportunity to the lowborn as much as to the aristocrat. For the fractured Mongol world, this was radical. For Temujin, it was the beginning of revolution. His most important early ally remained Togrul, the Khan of the Karati tribe. Togrul had once fought alongside Temujin's father Yasuge, and though he was much older and politically seasoned, he saw potential in the young warrior. After the rescue of Burt, Togrul declared Temujin his adopted son, giving him the backing of the powerful Karite Confederation. Temujin now had warriors, territory, and growing influence, but he was still just one power among many. His greatest rival at this stage was not a foreign enemy, but his own blood brother, Jamuka. Jamuka and Temujin had once shared dreams under the open sky, sworn to eternal brotherhood, but their visions for the Mongol future had diverged. Jamuka represented the traditionalist aristocracy, the steppes elite, who believed power should remain in the hands of noble clans. Temujin, in contrast, was amassing power from the fringes, shepherds, orphans, common warriors who had been trampled by the tribal hierarchy. These men flocked to him not just because he offered protection, but because he offered purpose. The first great test came in 1187. Temujin was formally declared Khan by his own followers, not of all the Mongols, but of his growing tribal coalition. This was a direct challenge to Jamuka, who soon raised a larger army to put his old friend back in his place. What followed was the Battle of Dalan Baljet, a clash that would shape the politics of the steppe for years to come. Temujin's forces were smaller, but more disciplined. His military organization, even at this early stage, was innovative. He divided his men into squads of tens, hundreds, and thousands, a system that would later define the Mongol army. He rewarded bravery, regardless of origin. But numbers still mattered, and Jamuka's larger army eventually overwhelmed him. Temujin was defeated. His forces were crushed. But Jamuka committed a fatal mistake. After the victory, he executed 70 young commanders from Temujin's ranks by boiling them alive, an act of such cruelty that it shocked even the hardened steppe tribes, turned Jamuka's triumph into a stain. Temujin, though beaten, became a martyr in the eyes of many. His legend grew. In the years that followed, Temujin retreated but rebuilt. He absorbed lessons from the defeat, improved his military structure, and doubled down on merit-based leadership. He learned from every loss. Where others saw only survival, Temujin saw strategy. His method of governance also began to evolve. He outlawed the traditional kidnapping of wives, elevated women to positions of authority, especially his mother Holan, and wife Burt, and instituted harsh punishments for theft and betrayal. These laws, though crude by modern standards, were revolutionary for the steppe. Temujin was forging something no Mongol leader had ever dared to dream. A state. Ranks continued to grow. Disaffected warriors, abandoned clans, and enslaved individuals who saw no future under the old aristocrats joined his banner. Among them were key figures who would later shape history. Subutai, the brilliant general, Gib, the former enemy-turned-loyal commander, and Gel, a bodyguard whose loyalty would become legendary. Step by step, tribe by tribe, Temujin was building momentum. He forged alliances not through marriage alone, but by offering structure, rewards, and shared destiny. Unlike the older Khans who ruled through fear and prestige, Temujin ruled through vision. He didn't just want to unite the Mongols. He wanted to transform them into a single force of destiny. By 1196, he was strong enough to support the Yuan Dynasty in its campaign against the Tatars, the very tribe that had poisoned his father. Temujin joined the war not out of loyalty to China, but to weaken his own enemies and gain valuable military experience. The campaign was a success. Tatars were crushed, and Temujin's power expanded again. Then fate handed him another opportunity. The Karaite, his once loyal allies, began to fracture. Togrul, now aging and politically entangled, grew suspicious of Temujin's growing power. Under the influence of his son, Sengom Togrul turned against his adoptive son. Temujin now faced a choice: retreat and preserve the alliance, or challenge the Karaite and claim their place. He chose war. But a brutal series of battles, Temujin crushed the Karaite and killed Togrul. Many Karaite warriors, including valuable generals, joined his ranks. With this victory, Temujin eliminated his greatest internal rival and took a massive step toward unifying the Mongol heartland. By the year 1200, Temujin stood as the dominant force in Mongolia. His reputation was fearsome, his army disciplined, and his rule, though still contested, undeniable. But he was not yet supreme. Muka still lingered, as did the powerful Naiman and Merkit tribes. Full unification lay ahead, but the world could already feel the winds changing. A storm was gathering, a storm with a name, and that name was about to echo far beyond the steppe. At the dawn of the 13th century, the steppes of Mongolia were beginning to tremble beneath the feet of a rising storm. Temujin, once an outcast child scrounging for food, had transformed into a formidable warlord with a vision. He had defeated the powerful Karaite, driven his enemies into exile, and attracted thousands of followers. Yet the dream of a unified Mongol nation, one people under one Khan, was still just that, a dream. Standing in his path were two mighty forces, and both would have to fall before Temujin could ascend as the supreme ruler of the steppe. These were the Naiman and Jamuka. The Naiman were powerful, proud, and steeped in tradition. They held the western reaches of Mongolia and were known for their wealth, sophistication, and alliance building. Their warriors were heavily armed, their leaders educated and politically savvy. Unlike many other steppe tribes, the Naiman had been exposed to Nestorian Christianity and Central Asian culture, giving them an air of cosmopolitanism. To many, they were the true heirs to the steppe's legacy. Jamuka, meanwhile, remained a symbol of the old world. Though he had once crushed Temujin at Dalan Baljut, the tide had turned. His cruelty after that battle, boiling 70 captured officers alive, had alienated many. His insistence on preserving aristocratic privilege had stifled his ability to grow. Yet he was still dangerous, had deep connections among the elite, and his lineage carried weight. Most importantly, he was a cunning tactician and a master of steppe diplomacy. Temujin knew that time was not on his side. His army was growing, but so was the threat of a combined counterattack. If Jamuka, the Naiman, and the Merkit united, and they were close to doing so, they could crush him. He needed to strike first, and strike hard. He began by strengthening his own internal structure. Temujin held a Kurulta, a grand council of his supporters, and reorganized the army with ruthless efficiency.
How?
No longer would men fight under tribal banners alone. He instituted a decimal system. Squads of 10, companies of 100, battalions of 1,000, and divisions of 10,000. Loyalty to tribe was replaced by loyalty to unit, and ultimately to him. This structure wasn't just military, it was social engineering. Men from different clans were mixed. Commanders were promoted based on ability, not blood. The old tribal divisions were being erased, replaced by a new Mongol identity forged in war and discipline. But perhaps most radical was Temujin's law code. The Yasa, though partly mythologized, this evolving code outlawed theft, adultery, betrayal, and the kidnapping of women. It demanded obedience, order, and justice. For a people long governed by revenge and clan feuds, it was revolutionary. Temujin wasn't just building an army, he was building a state. In 1201, Jamuka made his move. He was elected Gur Khan, universal ruler, by a coalition of tribal leaders, including the remnants of the Merkit and a large faction of the Naiman. With thousands of horsemen at his back, he set out to destroy Temujin once and for all. But Temujin was ready. The two armies met at the Battle of the 13 Sides. What followed was one of the bloodiest and most decisive clashes in Mongol history. Temujin's troops, drilled and organized, outmaneuvered the larger but less coordinated enemy force. His use of feigned retreats, encirclement tactics, and disciplined command structures tore through Jamuka's coalition. In the aftermath, Jamuka's army disintegrated. He fled, but his dream of dominance had died. His allies deserted him. One by one, the surviving leaders surrendered to Temujin. Then something extraordinary happened. Jamuka's own men, hoping to gain favor, betrayed him and brought him to Temujin in chains. Now, Temujin stood before the man who had once been his closest friend, then his deadliest rival. What he did next would shape the moral character of his rule. He did not reward the traitors. He executed the men who had betrayed Jamuka, declaring that a man who betrays his own leader cannot be trusted by any Khan. Then he turned to Jamuka, wounded, weary, but proud. Jamuka, in one of history's most poignant moments, refused to join Temujin. He had lived by the aristocratic code, and he would die by it. Temujin, recognizing the nobility in this, granted his old blood brother a noble's death. Execution without bloodshed, likely through breaking the spine. With Jamuka's death, the last major rival in the eastern steppe was gone. But the greatest test still lay ahead. The Nemun. They were led by Taiyan Khan and his brilliant but impulsive son, Kuklug. The Nemun ruled the western steppe with confidence. Their lands were rich in horses, metals, and skilled archers. Many believed they would crush Temujin, just as the Karaite once had. But unlike his enemies, Temujin had learned from every defeat. The Nemun would soon learn that they were no longer fighting a tribal warlord. They were facing a man who was already thinking like an emperor. The Nemun posed the final and greatest internal obstacle to Temujin's dream of Mongol unification. They were powerful, well-organized, and culturally sophisticated. Their army rivaled Temujin's in numbers, and their leadership was deeply respected across the steppe. To challenge them would not just be a military endeavor, would be a test of everything Temujin had built: his authority, his tactics, and his vision for a new Mongol order. Taiyan Khan, the patriarch of the Nemun, was a seasoned ruler who had long considered Temujin a dangerous upstart. His son Kuklug was bold, impatient, and hungry for power. Between them, the Nemun represented the last bastion of aristocratic dominance on the steppe. They underestimated Temujin, and even more critically, they underestimated how much the political winds had shifted in his favor. Before launching his campaign, Temujin reinforced alliances with smaller tribes along the Nemun frontier, neutralizing potential threats from the flanks. He then called another Kurultai and announced that he would no longer be merely a Khan. Among Khans, he was now Genghis Khan, the universal ruler of all Mongols. This was more than a title. It was a declaration of a new world order. The Nemun responded with defiance. Taiyan Khan believed Temujin's army was an overextended patchwork of loyalists and mercenaries, incapable of withstanding a head-on assault. He gathered his warriors, reinforced by Kuklug's own detachment and remnants of the defeated Merket and Jamuka's men, and prepared for war. In the spring of 1204, the two forces met in the Altai Mountains, near the headwaters of the Orkhan River. Temujin once again showed his genius for psychological warfare. He ordered each of his warriors to light 5 campfires at night, making his army appear 5 times larger than it was. The illusion worked. Nemun scouts returned with wildly exaggerated reports of the enemy's size, sowing doubt and fear in Taiyan Khan's ranks. As dawn broke, Temujin launched a well-coordinated offensive. His troops, divided into wings of 10,000 Mantumans, attacked with disciplined ferocity. He deployed classic Mongol tactics: swift cavalry charges, feigned retreats, and encircling maneuvers. His generals Jib, Subutai, and Kublai executed their orders with precision. Taiyan Khan's forces began to collapse under the pressure. The battle turned into a rout when the Nemun's flanks broke and their center was encircled. Taiyan was mortally wounded, and his loyal bodyguard was wiped out. Kuklug, however, escaped into the highlands with a portion of the army. The Nemun were broken. Their lands, once the jewel of the steppe, were now under Genghis Khan's rule. But he wasn't done. As the dust of internal war settled over the Mongolian steppe, Genghis Khan stood unmatched, both feared and revered. The tribal confederations had been shattered and reassembled under a new banner, his banner. but unification was only the beginning. Genghis Khan did not envision a kingdom of tents and pastures alone. He sought something greater, an empire, forged by conquest, bound by law, and sanctified by destiny. At the Kurultai near the sacred Anan River, the foundation of that empire was laid in ceremony and blood oath. The scene was unlike anything the Mongols had ever witnessed. Delegates from every corner of the steppe gathered, warlords, shamans, generals, elders, all kneeling before the man who had changed the very fabric of their existence. He was no longer Temujin. He was now Genghis Khan, sovereign of all the Mongols, the ruler ordained by the eternal blue sky, the wielder of the divine right to conquer the world. The title carried immense symbolic weight. Genghis, possibly derived from the Turkic word for oceanic, or universal, marked the limitless scope of his ambition. His elevation was more than a coronation. It was a declaration of destiny. At this sacred council, Genghis Khan solidified the political architecture of his emerging empire. The Yasa was formalized as the supreme legal code, binding all subjects, regardless of tribe or rank. It mandated loyalty, discipline, meritocracy, and above all, obedience to the Khan. Horse thieves were executed, adultery was punished severely, and feuds between clans were outlawed. The law superseded blood. Order replaced chaos. Then came the restructuring of society itself. The decimal military system, 100,000 and 10,000 man units, became permanent. Commanders were promoted not by noble birth, but by battlefield valor and loyalty. Entire clans were reassigned, merged, or broken apart to prevent factionalism. Each man was given a place, and each place was watched. To enforce his rule, Genghis Khan created the Kesheg, an elite imperial guard composed of his most trusted warriors. These men protected his person, served as his emissaries, and acted as enforcers of his will. From their ranks came future generals and governors, men like Subutai, Jib, and Jelm. Genghis Khan also established the Yam, an early version of a postal relay system. Across the steppe, relay stations were built every 25 to 30 miles, where fresh horses and supplies awaited mounted messengers. With this system, messages could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days, a vital tool for governance and future campaigns. But the most revolutionary act of Genghis Khan's early reign was ideological. He did not claim divine descent or aristocratic right. Instead, he told his people that the sky itself had chosen him. His authority came not from ancestry, but from merit and vision. This meritocratic ethos became the beating heart of the Mongol Empire. The lowborn could rise, the noble could fall. Only loyalty and competence mattered. Now unified, the Mongols were no longer just a confederation of horsemen. They were a machine, organized, brutal, and purpose-driven. With peace at home secured, the question was no longer if the Mongols would expand, but where they would strike first. To the south and west lay the Tanjit Kingdom of Western Xia, a sedentary, prosperous, and relatively insulated realm nestled between the Yellow River and the Gobi Desert. It controlled vital trade routes and had a formidable army of infantry, cavalry, and war elephants. Its capital, Yinchuan, was surrounded by thick walls and deep moats, seemingly impenetrable to nomadic raiders. But Genghis Khan was no ordinary raider. In 1209, he led his first foreign expedition into Tangut territory. It was a test, not just of his military might, but of his ability to wage siege warfare, something the steppe had never mastered. He brought with him Chinese engineers captured from the Yuan Dynasty and used their knowledge to build siege engines, catapults, and battering rams. The Tanguts, shocked by the boldness and speed of the invasion, retreated to their fortified cities. But Genghis Khan would not be denied. He laid siege to the fortress of Wulahai and took it, then marched toward Yinchuan itself. The campaign was long and brutal. Rivers were dammed and diverted. Supplies were scarce. But Genghis Khan's forces adapted, trading, pillaging, and improvising as they advanced. Eventually, the Tanguts sued for peace. They agreed to become a vassal state, pay tribute, and supply troops for future Mongol campaigns. Genghis Khan accepted. For now, he had no interest in holding sedentary lands yet. What he wanted was obedience and a reputation. The world had now heard the name of Genghis Khan. His army returned to the steppe triumphant. For the Mongols, it was a revelation. They could defeat city dwellers. They could breach walls, shatter kingdoms, and command tribute. No longer were they a people feared only by their neighbors. They were now a force with continental reach. Genghis Khan, ever the strategist, already had his sights on a bigger prize: the Yuan Dynasty. 2. The southeast, the Jin controlled northern China, a vast empire of cities, wealth, and population. Its emperors had long viewed the steppe as a frontier to be bribed or subdued. They had supported Temujin's early rivals and treated the Mongols as unruly vassals. Now Genghis Khan would teach them that the steppe had changed. The Khan had risen. The tribes were one. The world would never be the same. In the early 13th century, as the Mongol steppe thundered beneath the hooves of a newly united people, Genghis Khan's gaze turned southward, toward the ancient, glittering heart of Asia, China, specifically the Yuan Dynasty. To the Mongols, the Jin realm was a land of near-mythic wealth. It stretched across the vast plains of northern China, encompassing fertile farmland, walled cities, and millions of people. It was defended by legions of trained soldiers, sophisticated fortresses, and a rigid bureaucratic apparatus that had stood for generations. To Genghis Khan, it was not just a tempting prize. It was a threat wrapped in arrogance. The Jin had once played a dangerous game on the steppe. In the decades before Temujin's rise, Jin emperors had meddled in tribal politics, favoring one Mongol warlord over another, bribing some, crushing others. They viewed the steppe as a volatile frontier, useful for cheap horses and pliable mercenaries. They had supported the Tatars who murdered Temujin's father and armed the enemies he had later defeated. That insult had not been forgotten. Now, in 1211, Genghis Khan saw his moment. The Jin were experiencing internal decay. Corruption gnawed at their administration. Their military was bloated and sluggish. The population was taxed to the breaking point. Worse still, their emperors had grown complacent, confident that their great wall, their fortified cities, and their vast armies could withstand any threat from the north. But they had never faced an enemy like the Mongols. Genghis Khan began his campaign with meticulous preparation. This was not a raid. It was a full-scale invasion. Scouts were dispatched months in advance, mapping mountain passes, identifying weaknesses in Jin defenses, and cataloging the terrain. Chinese defectors were brought into the Mongol court to explain siege tactics, city life, and the Jin political structure. Even the Yam, the Mongol courier system, was extended south to support long-range communication across the front. When he moved, it was with precision and fury. In the spring of 1211, Genghis Khan led a massive army southward, divided into wings commanded by his most trusted generals. Jib, the master of the flank attack. Subutai, still young, but already brilliant in logistics and maneuver. And his eldest son Joki, now bloodied in battle and eager to prove himself. Together, they crossed the Gobi Desert and surged through the passes of the Great Wall like a tidal wave. The Jin were unprepared for the speed. Fortresses that had taken decades to construct were bypassed or taken within days. The Mongols didn't behave like a traditional army. They didn't besiege cities and wait. They struck supply lines, used feigned retreats to draw out defenders, then destroyed them in the open field. Their horses were swift, their archers deadly, and their tactics utterly alien to the lumbering Jin commanders. One of the earliest and most symbolic victories came at the Battle of Yehuling, a mountainous region that served as a key defensive bottleneck into the Jin heartland. The Jin had stationed tens of thousands of troops there, believing the terrain would neutralize the Mongol cavalry. They were wrong. Genghis Khan used his knowledge of terrain to lure the Jin army into the canyons, then blocked their exits and rained arrows from the heights. Trapped and slaughtered, the Jin suffered catastrophic losses. Their general Wanyan Chenyu was executed, and the Mongol path to the capital was now wide open. From Yehuling, Genghis Khan advanced deeper into Jin territory, capturing cities and fortresses along the way. Where resistance was light, he spared the population and took administrators into his service. But where resistance was fierce, retribution was merciless. Entire garrisons were wiped out. Cities that defied him were burned, their inhabitants massacred. It was psychological warfare on an imperial scale, the kind of terror that would echo across Asia for generations. The Jin capital, Jiangdu, now stood within reach. Jiangdu was the heart of the dynasty, a sprawling city of stone walls, palace gardens, and merchant wealth. Its defenses were formidable, yet inside, panic reigned. Refugees from the north flooded the city. The court debated whether to flee or fight. Some ministers urged negotiation, others called for holy war. The emperor dithered. In the winter of 1212, Genghis Khan arrived outside the gates of Jiangdu. He did not rush the siege. Instead, he encamped and let the fear fester. Engineers built siege towers, trebuchets, and battering rams using local labor and timber. His archers fired messages over the walls promising mercy if the city surrendered, and death if it resisted. The defenders held out for weeks, but supplies dwindled. Riots broke out inside. When the Mongols finally breached the outer wall, a full-scale assault followed. The fighting was brutal. Street by street, alley by alley, ires raged. By the time it was over, tens of thousands lay dead, and Jiangdu was in ashes. Genghis Khan did not stay to rule. He appointed a governor, took tribute, and withdrew his main army back to the steppe. He had made his point. The Jin would survive, for now. But their aura of invincibility was gone. The northern half of their empire was in ruins, their people traumatized, their cities broken. From this point on, they would live in fear of the next Mongol return. More importantly, the world had changed. No longer was China invulnerable behind its walls. No longer was the steppe seen as a wilderness of savages. The balance of power had shifted. The Mongols, for the first time, had successfully taken on a major sedentary empire and won. And Genghis Khan had learned something crucial. Empires could fall, cities could burn, the world was conquerable. The dragon had roared and been silenced. But the storm had only just begun. Following the fall of Jiangdu in 1215, Genghis Khan did not rest. He returned to the steppe not to celebrate, but to plan. The Yuan Dynasty, though bloodied and humiliated, still held vast territory and immense resources in southern Manchuria and the North China Plain. Genghis Khan knew that, to truly destroy an empire, one must tear out its roots, not just its cities and armies, but its legitimacy, its networks, and its spirit. For the next 5 years, Mongol forces plunged deeper into Jin territory with a single mission: break the back of the dragon. The invasion escalated in scope and savagery. No longer was it merely a military campaign. It became a systematic dismantling of the Jin world. Under Genghis Khan's orders, the Mongols divided into multiple columns, sweeping across the countryside, taking towns, destroying fortresses, and burning food stores. This strategy served two purposes. It denied the Jin their logistical base and sowed terror across their population. The Mongol army evolved during this phase. Genghis Khan learned to integrate siege engineers, Chinese defectors, Khitan rebels, and even former Jin commanders into his war machine. With every conquered town, his knowledge of Chinese warfare deepened. Engineers taught his men to construct massive siege engines capable of hurling stones, firebombs, and even diseased corpses over walls. The Mongol armies became more than cavalry. They became mobile cities of death, combining the speed of the steppe with the cunning of city seekers. Wherever they moved, they left ash and silence. One of the key turning points in this scorched campaign was the siege of Datong. Located along the strategic frontier routes in the Shaanxi region, Datong was heavily fortified and garrisoned with seasoned troops. The Mongols had attempted to take it in 1212, but were repulsed. In 1216, they returned. With vengeance, under the command of Subutai and Gib, the Mongols surrounded the city, constructed siege platforms, and launched an unrelenting bombardment. They tunneled beneath the walls, cut off all water sources, and sowed psychological panic by releasing prisoners who carried tales of other cities' destruction. After several weeks, Datong fell. What followed was a deliberate massacre. Unlike earlier surrenders, no quarter was given. Genghis Khan had issued a chilling decree. Cities that resisted twice would not survive. The population was exterminated, and the city became a monument to disobedience. The Jin began to crumble internally. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan used another potent weapon: divide and conquer. He encouraged rebellion among the Jin's subject peoples, The Khitan, Tanguts, and even Han Chinese peasants under heavy Jin taxation rose up, either joining the Mongols or attacking Jin garrisons on their own. In some cases, entire communities would open their gates to the Mongols in exchange for protection. Genghis Khan, ever pragmatic, often honored these deals, at least initially, sparing those who surrendered and installing cooperative local leaders under Mongol oversight. The Jin court descended into chaos. Emperor Xuanzang, desperate to preserve what remained of his realm, moved the capital south to Kaifeng in 1214. It was a stunning humiliation. Never in the dynasty's history had its imperial center been abandoned to foreign invaders. The move shattered morale. To the Mongols, it was proof that the dragon's head had turned to flee. Genghis Khan responded by razing Zhengdu again, this time systematically dismantling its walls and reducing the city to ruins. The symbolic heart of the Jin dynasty was erased from the map. He then launched a cleansing operation across Hubei and Shaanxi, ensuring that no Jin army could regroup. But it was not only military conquest that marked this phase of the war. Genghis Khan began to experiment with empire building. In captured territories, he installed loyal governors, both Mongol and local, and initiated a taxation system based on census reports provided by surrendered Jin officials. Markets were reopened. Roads were cleared. Religious leaders, Buddhist, Taoist, Muslim, were granted protection provided they did not resist Mongol authority. This was the early blueprint of the Pax Mongolica, a brutal conquest followed by stable governance. The iron fist followed by a velvet glove. Still, the Jin resisted. Guerrilla forces emerged in the hills and valleys. Fortresses once thought lost were recaptured. The Jin court in Kaifeng tried to rally the people, issuing proclamations, invoking Confucian virtue, and offering rewards for Mongol heads. Genghis Khan responded with fire. In 1217, he personally led a renewed campaign into Shandong and the Central Plains. This was not conquest in the traditional sense. These were raids of annihilation, columns of horsemen moving from town to town, demanding surrender and obliterating all who refused. In some places, they burned libraries and temples. In others, they spared only the artisans, engineers, and women of childbearing age. This was genocide, conquest and strategy fused into one terrible engine. It was not born of hatred, but of method. Genghis Khan believed that terror would break resistance faster than any siege, and he was correct. By 1218, the Jin dynasty had lost nearly half its territory. Its population had plummeted. Entire provinces were in ruins, their agricultural systems shattered. Refugees wandered from village to village, telling tales of flaming arrows and walls soaked in blood, but the Mongols had not yet delivered the final blow. That would come later. For now, Genghis Khan turned west, toward a new and unprovoked insult, one that would spark an entirely different kind of war. But before the Khan departed China, he left behind a region forever altered, a kingdom gasping its last breath, and a message to all who would defy the storm. No wall is high enough, no city is strong enough, no empire is eternal. As 1218 dawned, the Jin dynasty lay like a bleeding dragon across the plains of northern China, its scales shattered, its claws broken. Yet, like all cornered beasts, it still lashed out in desperation. And despite years of relentless Mongol pressure, it was not yet dead. Genghis Khan had succeeded in crippling the empire's northern strongholds, toppling its capital Zhengdu, and forcing the court into humiliating retreat. But victory, he knew, was not the same as annihilation, and annihilation was the goal. Yet at this very moment, something unexpected pulled his attention away. A new opportunity in the west. The Khwarezmian Empire had insulted him gravely, executing his envoys and seizing a Mongol trade caravan. This offense, for a man who regarded diplomatic immunity as sacred, could not be tolerated. But leaving the war against the Jin half-finished would be a mistake. So before riding westward to punish the Khwarezmians, Genghis Khan implemented a new strategy: delegated destruction. He entrusted the final phase of the Jin War to his most trusted generals and his sons. Chief among them was Mukhali, a brilliant and loyal commander of humble background who had risen through merit alone. Mukhali would become the de facto ruler of occupied northern China, the first Mongol governor of a Chinese realm, and the man tasked with finishing the job. With full authority, Mughal launched a renewed offensive between 1218 and 1223. His armies operated across Hubei, Shandong, Henan, and even reached as far south as the Yellow River. Using the same lightning-fast cavalry raids and psychological warfare tactics perfected by Genghis Khan, Mughali's forces burned Jin supply depots, decimated their dwindling armies, and further shattered civilian morale. But Mughal also showed surprising administrative talent. He recognized that maintaining control required more than bloodshed. He worked with surrendered Jin officials, reinstated agricultural policies, and continued census-taking in occupied regions. He even allowed Confucian schools to reopen under Mongol supervision. This was not compassion. It was pragmatism. Stability, he knew, was a weapon too. The Jin dynasty, now ruled by Emperor Aizong, continued to cling to survival. They appealed to the southern Song dynasty for help, trying to forge an alliance against the Mongols. The Song, traditional enemies of the Jin, hesitated. They feared the Mongols even more than the Jin, and rightly so. For now, they chose neutrality. Meanwhile, the Jin court enacted desperate reforms. Conscription laws were tightened, new taxes were levied, fortresses were rebuilt, secret police rooted out suspected collaborators. But all of it was too little, too late. The countryside remained lawless. Entire provinces refused to pay taxes, either out of fear or sympathy for the Mongols. By 1223, the Jin realm was a ghost of its former self. And then, as if the heavens themselves sealed the verdict, tragedy struck the Mongols. Mughal died of illness. The timing couldn't have been worse. His death briefly stalled Mongol operations in China. But Genghis Khan, who had just concluded the apocalyptic war in Central Asia, was already preparing his next move, and this time it would be final. In 1226, he returned to China. This last campaign, however, would not be against the Jin directly, but against another Chinese kingdom, the Western Xia, the Tanguts. They had betrayed the Mongols by refusing military support during the Jin War and had tried to ally with the Jin in secret. Genghis Khan was furious. He diverted his forces westward, besieged the Xia capital at Ningxia, and began one of the most brutal campaigns of his life. City after city fell, and entire populations were exterminated. He demanded the total eradication of the Tangut royal line, and saw it through to the letter. The Tanguts were erased as a political entity. But this campaign took its toll. In 1227, just as victory was secured, Genghis Khan fell ill, either from battle wounds or disease, and died. His death was kept secret for months, hidden even from his own soldiers. His body was taken back to Mongolia, where legend says it was buried in an unmarked grave, the workers all executed to preserve the location's secrecy. Yet even in death, his storm rolled on. Before he died, Genghis Khan left explicit instructions to his heirs. Finish what I started. His son Ogedei, who succeeded him as Great Khan, obeyed with deadly resolve. In 1232, under Ogedei's leadership, the Mongols launched their final invasion of the Jin. The Jin, now reduced to a strip of territory around Kaifeng, made a final alliance with the southern Song, but the Song betrayed them at the last moment. Striking from the rear to claim territory while the Jin were distracted by the Mongols, in 1233 Kaifeng was besieged. Starvation and disease decimated the population. Desperate Emperor Azan fled, hoping to escape south, but his guards betrayed him. Realizing the end had come, he hanged himself in a humble temple. By 1234, the last Jin stronghold fell. After over 2 decades of war, the Jin dynasty, once one of the mightiest empires in East Asia, was gone. The Mongols stood victorious. They had not merely defeated a dynasty. They had changed the map of the world. The old order walls, bureaucracies, feudal hierarchies had proven powerless before their whirlwind war machine. In its place, a new world was rising, shaped in the crucible of fire and ash. But Genghis Khan's eyes, even in death, were still watching beyond the horizon. He had taught his sons that no empire should stand unchallenged, that conquest was both duty and destiny. And now, with China burning behind them and the world before them, the Mongols would ride west, toward Persia, Russia, Europe. The dragon had been slain. The storm was only gathering. By 1218, the Mongol Empire stood at a turning point. The Jin Dynasty in the east lay shattered. China was bleeding. The steppes had been tamed. Genghis Khan, now ruler of the largest contiguous territory the world had ever seen, could have rested. He could have consolidated. He could have ruled in peace. But the Khan was not a man of stillness. His gaze turned west, toward the lands of Islam, where a new empire had risen across Persia and Central Asia. The Khwarezmian Empire. It was powerful, wealthy, and proud, controlled the Silk Road, commanded vast cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench. It held sway from the Caspian Sea to the Hindu Kush. At its head was Sultan Muhammad II, an ambitious and imperious ruler who had defeated the Seljuks, fought the Abbasid Caliph, and imagined himself the equal of the great conquerors of history. But in this clash of titans, only one could prevail. The opening act of this cataclysmic war was deceptively mundane: a caravan. Genghis Khan, seeking to open diplomatic and commercial relations with the Khwarezmian Empire, it dispatched a large trade caravan to the city of Otrar, a crucial frontier town near the Sir Darya River. The caravan was loaded with precious goods: silk, silver, musk, jade, and accompanied by 500 merchants, many of whom were Muslims from Mongol territory. But the governor of Otrar, a man named Inalhuk, saw an opportunity for plunder. Claiming the caravan was a cover for espionage, he arrested the merchants, confiscated their goods, and executed many of them. Genghis Khan responded not with war, yet, but with diplomacy. He sent a delegation of 3 ambassadors to Sultan Muhammad, demanding justice, the punishment of Inalhuk, and the return of his merchants' property. The Sultan's response sealed the fate of his empire. He had one of the Mongol envoys beheaded, and the others mutilated. Their heads were sent back east as a warning. To Genghis Khan, this was not merely an insult. It was a crime against the sacred tradition of diplomatic immunity, a violation that demanded vengeance. Not only to punish the offender, but to ensure such insolence would never occur again. The storm was coming. In early 1219, Genghis Khan gathered his generals: Geb, Sabbatai, Ogedei, Chagatai, and Tolui, and revealed his plan: a full-scale invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. But this was not a reckless march into the unknown. It was a masterpiece of strategic preparation. The Mongols spent months gathering intelligence on terrain, climate, cities, and enemy dispositions. They built boats to cross rivers. They stockpiled grain and fodder. They bribed or coerced local tribes along the borders. Every step was measured, every move calculated. The invasion began in the spring of 1219. Over 100,000 Mongol warriors crossed the Tian Shan Mountains and surged into the Khwarezmian frontier like a tidal wave. Their first target, Otrar, the city where the caravan had been seized. Genghis Khan himself led the siege. For 5 months, Otrar resisted bravely. Inalhuk held out within the city's citadel, rallying defenders behind its thick mud brick walls. But the Mongols were relentless. They used siege engines, sappers, fire arrows, and even poisoned water sources. Eventually, betrayal broke the city. A faction within Otrar opened the gates to the Mongols. Inalhuk was captured alive. Genghis Khan ordered him brought before him in chains. And here, legend takes a dark turn. According to Persian chroniclers, Inalhuk was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment befitting his greed. Whether this account is apocryphal or not, it reflects the level of fury the Khan reserved for violators of law and custom. Otrar was razed, its population massacred or enslaved. The city, once a proud bastion of Central Asian trade, was reduced to dust. But this was only the beginning. Rather than march directly westward, Genghis Khan divided his forces into multiple coordinated armies. His genius lay not just in brute force, but in multi-directional warfare. One army under Joki and Chagatai moved to besiege Bukhara, a center of Islamic learning. Another, under Geb and Subutai, made a daring march through the Kizilkam Desert to outflank Khwarezmian strongholds from the rear. A third followed the central path toward Samarkand, the jewel of the empire. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan himself remained mobile, directing the invasion like a maestro conducting a symphony of destruction. In late 1219, Bukhara fell. Despite its walls and elite defenders, the city stood little chance. The Mongols, experts in siege warfare by now, breached its defenses within weeks. Once inside, they unleashed horror. Temples were plundered, libraries torched, and scholars put to the sword. At the city's Friday mosque, Genghis Khan is said to have mounted the pulpit and declared, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether these exact words were spoken or not, the message was clear. Resistance meant obliteration. Samarkand, the imperial capital, followed in early 1220. It was one of the richest cities in the Muslim world, boasting gardens, mosques, and shimmering palaces. But wealth could not stop arrows. The defenders, over 100,000 strong, were betrayed from within, just as at Otrar. The Mongols flooded into the city. As always, they spared artisans, engineers, and scholars, but the rest faced death or slavery. The Sultaness' elite war elephants were driven into a panic and turned on their own troops during the battle. It was chaos, fire, and screams. A city of dreams turned into a graveyard. Sultan Muhammad, witnessing the collapse of his empire, fled westward. He abandoned his capital, his court, and even his own family. Pursued relentlessly by Gib and Subutai, he fled from fortress to fortress, disguised, hunted like an animal. His empire, vast and mighty, collapsed in a matter of months. From the Caspian Sea to the Oxus River, cities burned, rivers ran red. Refugees fled in every direction, carrying tales of horsemen who shot arrows without missing and sacked cities without mercy. The Mongols had become a myth, a terror, a force of nature. And still, the worst was yet to come. For in Genghis Khan's eyes, no empire deserved to fall halfway. The wrath of the West had only begun. In the wake of the obliteration of Otrar, Bukhara, and Samarkand, the Khwarezmian Empire, once so proud, so vast, stood paralyzed in fear and disbelief. How could this horde from the east, these wild men of the steppe, tear through centuries of civilization in mere months? But Genghis Khan had no intention of slowing down. His wrath was not yet satisfied. As 1220 turned to 1221. The Mongols continued their advance, unleashing a new campaign against the remaining cities of the empire. The next to fall would be Urgench, the Sultaness' original capital and one of the richest trading cities along the Silk Road. But Urgench was different. It was not just another city to conquer. It was a test of Mongol unity, discipline, and vision. Urgench was the seat of the Khwarezmian royal family. Its wealth was legendary. It resisted numerous invasions throughout its history and was surrounded by water channels that made sieges difficult. More importantly, its defense now fell to the Sultan's son and heir, Jalal ad-Din, Mingbornu, a prince of rare courage and charisma. Genghis Khan initially dispatched his sons Joki and Shugatai to capture the city. But tensions erupted between the two. Joki, the Khan's eldest son, had always lived under a cloud of suspicion, a result of the mystery surrounding his paternity. Some among the Mongols whispered he was not truly Chengis's son, but the child of Bert's captor during her brief time as a prisoner. Whether the rumor was true or not, it poisoned relations between the brothers. Now in the heat of the siege, that tension exploded. Shugatai accused Joki of hesitating, of being too lenient toward Urgench's defenders, perhaps even of harboring secret sympathies. The bickering became so severe that Genghis Khan had to intervene directly. He replaced them both and gave command to his third son, Ogedei. Under Ogedei's ruthless leadership, the Mongols took Urgench. The city's resistance was heroic. They fought from rooftop to rooftop in narrow alleys, using fire and stone to repel the invaders. But no city could withstand the Mongol tide forever. When Urgench finally fell, Genghis Khan faced a dilemma. The city was incredibly wealthy, filled with artisans, libraries, and priceless goods. But it had also resisted fiercely, and the Khan's wrath demanded an example be made. So, in one of the most infamous decisions of his career, he ordered total destruction. Urgench was burned. Its irrigation canals were destroyed. Its population, hundreds of thousands, was slaughtered. Chroniclers of the time claimed that the streets were so thick with blood that horses refused to walk through them. Whether these accounts are exaggerated or not, the city vanished from the map for generations. The Mongols now turned south and east, sweeping through the Persian plateau. Genghis Khan sent his son Tolui, known as the most ruthless of his heirs. to lay waste to the cities of Nishapur, Merv, Herat, and Balkh. These cities were ancient, some over 1,000 years old, centers of poetry, philosophy, and science. Tului showed them no mercy. At Merv, the entire population, as many as 700,000 people, was said to have been executed. In Nishapur, after a Mongol commander was killed by a sniper's arrow, Tului ordered not only the men but the women and children to be slain in retribution. He even ordered the skulls of the dead stacked into pyramids outside the city walls as a warning to all. In some places, the Mongols used psychological warfare to devastating effect. They would release a few survivors and allow them to flee to the next city, carrying horror stories. These stories often led entire cities to surrender without a fight, hoping for mercy. But surrender did not always guarantee survival. The Mongols had a precise policy: resist and be destroyed, submit and be ruled. Those who defied the Khan were annihilated. Those who submitted and remained loyal were integrated into the empire. Engineers were relocated to Karakoram. Administrators were kept alive to help run cities. Even Persian doctors and astronomers were brought east to serve the court. This duality, brutal vengeance and pragmatic incorporation, was at the heart of Genghis Khan's empire building. Meanwhile, Sultan Muhammad continued his flight. He had become a phantom, a ghost emperor. His armies had scattered. His court was in ruins, betrayed by his governors, refused aid by former allies, and hunted by the most efficient military machine on earth. The Sultan fled west across Persia, then south, then back to the Caspian Sea, and always behind him rode Jib and Subutai, the two greatest cavalry commanders in Mongol history. They pursued him with single-minded focus, traversing thousands of kilometers of deserts, rivers, and mountains. This was not merely military pursuit. It was psychological warfare. He wanted to send a message to the world. No enemy of the Khan escapes judgment. Finally, in 1221, on a remote island in the Caspian Sea, Sultan Muhammad died. Exhausted, diseased, and utterly broken, he passed away in hiding. A pitiful end for a man who once called himself the King of Kings. But his son Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu had survived, and he was not ready to surrender. Jalal ad-Din gathered the remnants of the Khwarezmian army and began a guerrilla resistance. In the mountains of modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, he launched raids against Mongol garrisons. For a time, he even managed to win a few battles, including one famous victory at Parwan, where a smaller Khwarezmian force defeated a Mongol detachment. It was a rare moment of light in an otherwise dark saga. Genghis Khan, enraged by the loss, personally led an army to hunt Jalal ad-Din down. The two sides clashed near the Indus River in 1221. Jalal ad-Din fought bravely, but he was outnumbered. His forces were crushed. As his army dissolved, he chose escape over capture. In a moment immortalized in legend, Jalal ad-Din rode his horse off a cliff into the Indus River and survived. He swam to the other side and vanished into the Punjab. Genghis Khan, watching from the opposite bank, is said to have admired the prince's courage. Such a son, he told his men, would be worthy of a father like me. It was the only time he ever praised an enemy in public. The Khwarezmian Empire was no more. Its cities were burned, its libraries lost, its people scattered to the winds. In less than 2 years, an empire that had stood for generations was swept away like dust before a storm. And in its ashes, the legend of the Mongols grew even darker. But Genghis Khan had no time for celebration. The West had been punished, yes, but the world was wide. New horizons called. His generals, especially Subutai, now dreamed of Europe. And Genghis, ever the architect of destiny, was ready to draw up the next blueprint of conquest. As the fire smoldered across the Persian plateau and the blood of cities ran into dust, a great silence fell, not just over the Khwarezmian realm, but across the entire Islamic world. Word of the Mongol onslaught spread like a contagion. From the marketplaces of Baghdad to the caravanserais of Damascus, the name Genghis Khan became synonymous with divine retribution. To some, he was the scourge of God, a punishment for decadence and division. To others, he was the Antichrist, or worse, the Ya'juj and Ma'juj of Quranic prophecy. Unleashed from the east in the end times, but beneath the horror lay cold, calculated genius. The Mongol War against the Khwarezmian Empire had not been just an act of vengeance, it had been a test case. A demonstration of how Genghis Khan could project power across vast distances, destroy entrenched kingdoms, and assimilate their remains into his own vision of empire. Let's pause and examine that vision. Genghis Khan, despite the destruction he wrought, was not a mere barbarian bent on annihilation. In the wake of every conquest, he sought to build a new order. And the Khwarezmian campaign was a cornerstone of that vision. Across the ruined cities of Persia and Central Asia, Mongol administrators moved in. Local collaborators were rewarded. Engineers and scribes were resettled. Taxation systems were restructured under the guidance of Chinese and Muslim advisors. The Mongols introduced standardized weights and measures, encouraged the use of paper money, and reopened the Silk Road under their protection. It was a paradox: devastation followed by order, slaughter followed by commerce. Cities like Balkh, Herat, and even parts of Samarkand began to recover. Not immediately, but under the foundations the Mongols laid. Trade resumed, caravan routes reopened. For those who had survived, the terror gave way to an unfamiliar peace, enforced by the shadow of Mongol discipline. And with the fall of the Khwarezmians, the door to the Islamic world had been kicked wide open. This campaign had brought Genghis Khan to the threshold of the Middle East, the lands of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and even Egypt. Though he would not march there himself, his sons and grandsons would. The seeds had been sown for the later campaigns of Hulagu Khan and the siege of Baghdad, events that would forever alter the trajectory of Islamic civilization. But even as Genghis Khan laid the groundwork for future campaigns, he was already turning his attention eastward again. There remained unfinished business in Tangut and Sha, in the Chinese heartlands. And more importantly, his own succession had to be settled. The empire was now too vast to rule from horseback alone. So in late 1221, having left a string of devastated cities in his wake, Genghis Khan gathered his forces and began the long journey back across the mountains and steps toward Mongolia. But he left behind something far more potent than soldiers: fear. In the lands he had conquered, children were named in prayers to ward off Mongol invasion. Moms spoke his name from the pulpits with trembling voices. Poets wrote verses of doom. Chroniclers invented new words to capture the scale of the catastrophe, for nothing in living memory had matched the scale of Mongol destruction. In Nishapur, the poet Adder had perished in the massacre. His death became symbolic of the loss of an entire culture. In Baghdad, historians debated whether the Mongols were a punishment for the sins of rulers or a test of the faithful. One chronicler, Juvayni, wrote, "Wherever the Mongols passed, no dog barked, no rooster crowed. It was as if the breath of life itself had been snuffed out." Yet others saw opportunity in the Mongol expansion. Venetian merchants, Armenian traders, and Nestorian missionaries found that under Mongol rule, the roads were safer than they had been in centuries. From China to the Black Sea, one could now travel with Mongol-issued passports, and many did. The Khwarezmian campaign had demonstrated to the world that Genghis Khan was not merely a conqueror, but the architect of a new world order, one in which tribes, nations, and religions were flattened under the hooves of Mongol horses, only to be reorganized into something new. And yet, amidst all this transformation, one figure still haunted the Khan's mind. Jalal ad-Din, the last prince of the Khwarezmians, remained alive. Somewhere in India, gathering forces, making alliances. Genghis Khan had spared him out of admiration, yes, but also curiosity. What would the young prince become? Would he rise again? Would he challenge the Mongol world? He never did. Jalal ad-Din would wander the courts of India and Anatolia for years, fighting petty wars, trying in vain to rally the Muslim world. But the Khwarezmian Empire was gone, and no one wanted to rebuild it. He died in obscurity, assassinated by Kurdish mercenaries. A prince without a kingdom, a hero without an audience. And so ended the Great War of the West. For Genghis Khan, the conquest of the Khwarezmians had proven what he already believed, that no empire could stand before him, not if he struck first, not if he struck hard. And though he would return east and die just 6 years later, the impact of this campaign would echo for centuries. Because from this point on, no one, not China, not Persia, not Europe, could ignore the Mongols again. They were no longer a regional power. They were the center of history, As Genghis Khan departed the smoldering ruins of the Khwarezmian Empire and turned his attention back eastward, he left behind more than just devastation. He left behind a legend. A terrifying storm from the east had swept through the Islamic world, and in its wake it had scattered the seeds of fear across continents. But for the Mongols, this was only the beginning. The Khwarezmian campaign had proven that the Mongol war machine could operate thousands of kilometers from its base in Mongolia and return victorious. Now, the question was, how far could it go? Genghis Khan, ever the visionary, had already begun to contemplate the answer. For that, he would unleash his deadliest weapons. Not swords, not siege engines, but men. Two names would now carve themselves into the chronicles of world history: Gib and Subutai, the Thunderbolt and the Fox. In 1220, even before the Khwarezmian campaign had fully concluded, Genghis gave a daring, almost insane order. Gib and Subutai were to take a reconnaissance in force, a term that belied the size and audacity of what was to follow. With an elite detachment of around 20,000 Mongol cavalry, they were to move westward, far beyond the known boundaries of Mongol influence. Their mission was not to conquer yet, but to map the Western world, test its defenses, gather intelligence, sow chaos, and most importantly, send a message. The Mongols were coming. And so, the two generals galloped into the Caucasus Mountains, riding through the lands of Georgia, Armenia, and beyond. These regions had long been fought over by greater empires: Byzantines, Persians, Arabs. Their rulers had grown used to the ebb and flow of regional wars, but they had never faced anything like the Mongols. The first to feel the shock was Georgia. In 1221, Gib and Subutai encountered King George IV Lasha and his forces. The Georgians were brave warriors, descended from a lineage of crusaders and defenders of Christendom. But their heavy cavalry, though formidable, was no match for the fluid and strategic maneuvering of the Mongol horse archers. In a series of battles, including a major one near Tbilisi, the Mongols crushed the Georgian army, scattering it across the valleys. Castles and fortresses that had stood for generations were reduced to embers. The Mongols moved like smoke, one day appearing in the mountains, the next sweeping down into valleys, raiding towns, burning fortifications, and vanishing before retaliation could be organized. They penetrated deep into Armenia and Azerbaijan, reaching the shores of the Caspian once again, not for retreat, but for conquest. At Ganja, they encountered fierce resistance. The Mongols responded by massacring entire districts. Then they moved north, into the steppe lands of the Alans and Cumans, fierce Turkic and Iranian tribes who had long resisted the great empires of Asia and Europe. Subutai, ever the master of psychological warfare, used deception as deftly as he wielded the sword. He approached the Cumans and made them an offer: betray your Alan allies, and you will be spared. The Cumans agreed. The Mongols crushed the Alans. Then, having destroyed the first half of the alliance, they turned on the Cumans and annihilated them as well. This strategy, divide, deceive, destroy, became a hallmark of the Mongol Western campaigns. With the steppe tribes shattered, the Mongols now eyed the riches of Kiev and Rus, a patchwork of princely states in what is now Ukraine and Western Russia. Though not yet a unified kingdom, the Rus principalities wielded considerable power, wealth, and a long tradition of resistance. But they had never encountered an enemy like the Mongols. In 1223, Gib and Subutai crossed the Dnieper River, a vast inland frontier that had marked the edge of many empires. There, they clashed with a coalition of Rus princes and Cuman allies, who had hastily joined forces to stop the eastern threat. The armies met at the Battle of the Kalka River, one of the most brutal and significant encounters in early Mongol-European contact. The Rus, overconfident and unfamiliar with Mongol tactics, fell into a classic trap. The Mongols feigned retreat, luring the combined army into pursuit across open steppe. Then, when the enemy was disorganized and spread thin, they turned and attacked with precision. The battle was a massacre. Thousands of Rus soldiers were cut down, entire noble families were wiped out. At the end, the Mongols captured several Rus princes alive. In a gesture of theatrical cruelty, they laid the princes on the ground, covered them with planks, and held. A feast upon their living bodies, slowly crushing them to death as they dined, a symbolic statement that those who defy the Mongols will be the foundation of their empire. And then, just as quickly as they had come, the Mongols vanished. Jib and Subutai led their exhausted troops south through the Volga steppes, looping back eastward toward Mongolia. Their reconnaissance had lasted 3 years and taken them through 10,000 kilometers of hostile territory, all while winning every single battle. It was one of the most successful deep-penetration military campaigns in human history. And now, the Mongols knew what lay to the west: disunity, rivalry, hubris, an open door. When Genghis Khan received their reports, he was deeply satisfied. He now understood the shape of the world that awaited beyond his empire. But he would not live to see the Mongols return to those lands in force. That task would fall to his descendants. His son Ogedei and his grandson Batu would take up the sword and carry the storm into the heart of Europe. But it was the trail blazed by Gib and Subutai, this campaign of fire and thunder, that had lit the way. The world had been warned. It had 3 decades to prepare, and it wasn't enough. As the dust of the Mongol hooves settled over the steppes of the Rus, Europe began to whisper of a dark force rising in the east. The survivors of the Battle of the Kalka River, few and broken, limped back to their cities with tales that sounded like the Book of Revelation come to life. What had come upon them? Who were these men who fought like spirits, vanished like shadows, and left nothing but bones and smoke behind? Europe, fragmented and pious, had seen many wars, but nothing had prepared it for this. The Mongols did not stay in the lands of the Rus. After their 3-year rampage, Jeb and Subutai had withdrawn across the steppes, their mission complete. But the psychological impact was permanent. The legend had begun. In the courts of Hungary, Poland, and the Holy Roman Empire, rumors began to fly. They were called Tatars, after a misheard tribal name. But even this was distorted to evoke Tartarus, the deep hell of Greek mythology. Chroniclers whispered of cannibal horsemen with iron discipline. Peasants told stories of a king with 1,000 sons, and a kingdom that stretched from the sunrise to the ends of the earth. The church feared them, but also misunderstood them. In Rome and Constantinople, some believed they were a lost Christian kingdom. Perhaps the army of Prester John, mythical Christian monarch from the east, foretold to save Christendom. Their destruction of Muslim powers in Central Asia seemed to align with this fantasy. Delegations were even considered. Would the Mongols be allies against Islam? But the truth was far more complex. Genghis Khan was neither Christian nor Muslim. His god was the eternal blue sky, and his empire answered only to him. Meanwhile, inside the Mongol world, the campaign to the west had revealed a tantalizing truth. Europe was disunited. Unlike China, which had been fragmented but rich in fortified cities and vast resources, or Khwarezm, which had wielded an enormous military before its fall, Europe was a mosaic of kingdoms, many of them bitter rivals. The Pope fought with the Holy Roman Emperor. France and England warred over inheritance. The Rus princes hated one another as much as they feared foreign invasion. This was fertile ground for Mongol expansion, but Genghis Khan did not move immediately. His mind was focused elsewhere, consolidating his empire, returning to China to deal with the recalcitrant Western Xia, and most importantly, planning the future of his dynasty. In 1227, just 6 years after the Kalka River, Genghis Khan died, reportedly after falling from his horse during a campaign in Western Xia. His death was kept secret for months, even from many Mongol commanders. His body was returned to Mongolia in silence, buried in an unknown location. Perhaps under the sacred Burkhan Khaldan mountain, the storm had paused. But it had not passed. At the Great Kurultai, the Mongol assembly of nobles, his son Ogedei was chosen as the new Great Khan. Ogedei was not the fiercest of the brothers. That honor belonged to Tolui, but he was level-headed, generous, and deeply loyal to his father's vision. And his vision was clear. Europe would be next. Ogedei, following the counsel of Subutai, decided to send a massive force westward, not just a raid this time, but an invasion. The sons of the Khan would lead it. Batu, the son of Joki, Guyuk, son of Ogedei, Monkey, son of Tolui, and Subutai himself, now an old man, but still a genius of the battlefield, would command. But first, a new front had to be opened. the Volga Bulgars, and the Kipchak steppe. These regions stood between the Mongol heartland and Europe. They would be tested, and as expected, they fell swiftly. Their cities burned, their warriors slaughtered, and the roads to the west were cleared. The stage was set for the invasion of Europe. The year was now 1236. Across Eastern Europe, warnings were sent from the east. Towns swallowed whole, forests turned to ash, entire peoples vanishing overnight. In Hungary, King Before received frantic appeals from the Cumans, refugees fleeing the steppe, allowed them to settle, hoping their horsemen could help defend his kingdom, but his nobles mistrusted them, and tensions flared. In Poland, the feuding Piast princes barely acknowledged the danger. They assumed the invaders would go around them. They were wrong. In Bohemia, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire, there was still disbelief. How could a distant people from beyond the steppes possibly reach their walled cities and trained armies? They would soon find out. But it was not just the military campaign that chilled the air in Europe. It was the ideology behind the Mongol expansion. Unlike many conquerors, the Mongols did not demand conversion, culture, or language. They demanded only submission. You could keep your faith, your language, your customs, as long as you paid tribute. Opened your gates and accepted the supremacy of the Khan, resist, and there would be no negotiation, no mercy. Mongol envoys would offer a simple choice: surrender or perish. Those who refused were systematically destroyed. And so, the Mongol Empire operated on a binary moral code: submit and live, resist and vanish. This duality terrified the European mind. It was total, it was alien. It did not leave room for diplomacy, delay, or half measures. And it was paired with an intelligence-gathering network that stunned even the most advanced states. Mongol spies infiltrated markets and monasteries. They measured roads, recorded enemy strengths, mapped rivers and mountains. When the campaign to conquer Europe finally began in 1237, the Mongols would already know more about Europe than Europe knew about them. And now at the edge of the Carpathians, the greatest military machine the continent had ever seen began to move. The rivers would freeze, the snows would fall, and behind them came the hooves of 10,000 thunderbolts. The Mongols were coming, and Europe would never be the same. Winter fell over Eastern Europe like a curtain of ice, but behind it came fire. The year was 1237. The Mongol Empire had returned, not as a distant storm or a legend from the east, but as a terrible reality. This time, it wasn't a raid. It was invasion. At the head of the campaign rode Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and son of Joki, though young. Duka was a powerful figure, commanding respect among the Mongol nobility. But the real mastermind behind the campaign was Subutai, now in his 70s, but as sharp and deadly as ever. Together they commanded a force of over 100,000 men, composed of Mongol cavalry, siege engineers, Chinese sappers, and auxiliary units drawn from the expanding empire. Their first target: the Rus principalities. Unlike Western Europe, which could rally under kings and popes, the Rus lands were divided among feuding princes: Kiev and Rus, Vladimir Sustel, Ryazan, Chernigov, Novgorod, and others. Their disunity was a gift to the Mongols. In December 1237, the Mongols descended on Ryazan. They sent emissaries demanding surrender. The prince refused. In response, Bata and Subutai unleashed their siege engines: catapults, battering rams, Chinese fire lances, and scaling towers. Within days, the city walls were breached. What followed was one of the most brutal massacres in Russian history. Ryazan was erased, its people slaughtered, its churches and cathedrals burned. Survivors fled into the forests with stories of death raining from the skies. But there was no time to mourn. Vladimir, one of the largest cities in Rus, fell next. Its stone cathedrals were smashed, its towers collapsed. Kozelsk, known for its fierce resistance, held out for 7 weeks. When the Mongols finally took it, they killed every inhabitant: men, women, and children. The pattern was clear: resist and be annihilated, or submit and survive. One by one, the Rus cities fell like dominoes. But not all would go so easily. In the far north, Novgorod stood unconquered, save not by its strength, but by mud and timing. The spring thaw turned the surrounding land into a swamp, making cavalry advance impossible. Subutai made the rare decision to withdraw. It was a brief mercy. By 1240, the Mongols had turned southwest. Their next target, Kiev, the ancient heart of the Rus. Once the center of Eastern Slavic civilization, Kiev had long declined in power. It remained a symbol, a spiritual and cultural capital. The Mongols encircled it in December 1240. The defenders, few and desperate, hoped for divine deliverance. None came. The walls were breached. The city, already weakened from internal strife and lack of support, was destroyed. Chronicles tell of blood flowing through the streets, of monasteries set ablaze, and of bells melted into puddles of bronze. By the end of the year, the Rus principalities had been shattered. Their lands were annexed into what became known as the Golden Horde, a western division of the Mongol Empire ruled by Bata and his descendants. But this was not the end. It was merely the gateway. Now the Mongols turned toward Europe proper, the Catholic kingdoms beyond the Carpathians. In early 1241, the Mongol armies divided into multiple columns. This strategy, classic Subutai, allowed them to strike on a broad front, confounding and overwhelming their enemies. One force swept into Poland, defeating Duke Henry the Pious at the Battle of Legnica. Their Mongol light cavalry used clouds of arrows and feigned retreats to break the Polish and German knights. European tactics, based on heavily armored shock cavalry, proved too rigid and inflexible. The Mongols used mobility, intelligence, and terror as weapons. In Legnica, the severed heads of fallen knights were piled into pyramids. At the same time, another force struck into Hungary, where King IV had rallied his armies. Here, too, the Mongols showed cunning. They lured forces into a trap at the Battle of Mohi near the river. On the night before the battle, Stubati secretly constructed a pontoon bridge across the river, flanking the Hungarian camp. As dawn broke, Mongol forces struck from both the front and rear. The result was catastrophic. Tens of thousands of Hungarian troops were annihilated. King barely escaped. The royal court fled westward. The Mongols entered Pest and then Buda, burning both. From here, they rampaged across the Hungarian plain, raiding as far as Croatia, Austria, and even the outskirts of Vienna. Europe was defenseless. Pope Gregory IX called for prayer and fasting. Kings wrote desperate letters. France, Germany, Italy. None were ready, and then stopped. In the spring of 1242, at the very peak of Mongol success, a message arrived from Karakorum, the Mongol capital. Ogedei Khan was dead. Mongol law required all princes of Genghis's blood to return for the election of a new great Khan. Batu, though he despised the politics of court life, was forced to halt the invasion and turn back. Europe had been saved, not by sword or strategy, but by fate. Had the campaign continued, there is every reason to believe that Vienna, and perhaps even Paris, might have fallen. The cities of Europe had never encountered anything like the Mongol military engine. Fortifications were weak, coordination was poor, and the enemy was faster, smarter, and more ruthless. As the Mongol army withdrew, they left behind a landscape of ruins and terror. Entire regions of Poland, Hungary, and Russia had been depopulated. Trade routes collapsed. Religious institutions were decimated. The psychological wound would linger for centuries. But for the Mongols, this was merely a strategic pause. The conquest of Europe had been postponed, not abandoned. Bata returned to the lower Volga and established Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde. From there, Mongol rule over the Rus would last for over 2 centuries. Tribute was demanded. Princes were humbled, and the memory of the Mongol tempest would shape Russian identity forever. Subutai, his final campaign complete, retired from the saddle, having led more successful campaigns over more terrain than perhaps any general in history. His legacy was unmatched, and Europe, though spared full conquest, would never again look eastward without fear. The Mongols had arrived like a dream, swift, unstoppable, and surreal, the way that they had left behind an empire of blood. In the windswept steppes of Central Asia, The grandsons of Genghis Khan once rode as allies, bound by kinship and ambition. But with the death of Genghis Khan in 1259, the thin line between brotherhood and betrayal snapped. The unity that once defined the Mongol Empire, its pulse driven by conquest and shared destiny, began to unravel. At its center stood two men who embodied the power and peril of this dynasty, Kublai and Arik Bey. Kublai, governor of northern China and a master of politics and diplomacy, had embraced many aspects of Chinese civilization. His court was rich, his ambitions global. To the north, Arik Bey, the traditionalist, held the Mongol heartland Karakoram and the sacred pastures where Genghis himself had ridden. Their rivalry would not just determine who wore the crown of Great Khan. It would fracture the very empire their grandfather had bled to build. When Mongol died during a campaign in China, no successor had been named. Kublai, stationed in the south, acted quickly. In 1260, he summoned a Kurultian assembly of Mongol nobles in his Chinese territories and was declared Great Khan. But Arik Bey, holding the imperial capital of Karakoram, did the same in the north. Two brothers, two thrones, one empire now split by ambition and geography. The war between them was bitter and deeply symbolic. Kublai's forces were supplied by the rich agricultural lands of China, giving him the resources to fund a standing army, siege weapons, and diplomatic missions to gain allies. Arik Bey, meanwhile, drew support from the traditional Mongol nobility and the western khanates of Chagatai and the Golden Horde, who feared Kublai's Sinicization. The conflict was not just military, it was ideological. Kublai represented a cosmopolitan, imperial model, Mongol in name, but increasingly Chinese in practice. Arik Bey stood for the old ways, the nomadic warrior elite, the purity of the steppe. Their war, fought over several years, sent shockwaves through the entire empire. Cities were sacked, loyalties shifted like sand. Brothers and cousins chose sides, and trust became a memory. By 1264, the tide had turned. Kublai's wealth, organization, and control of the populous south gave him the advantage. Arik Bey, isolated and lacking food supplies, was forced to surrender. He was brought before Kublai and imprisoned. Though spared execution, he died a few years later in captivity. The war had ended, but the price was immense. Kublai's authority was no longer recognized by all Mongol rulers, and the dream of a unified empire under one Khan was fading. The civil war between Kublai and Arik Bey marked the beginning of the end for Mongol unity. From the ashes of their conflict, regional powers would rise, rulers who owed more to local identity than imperial kinship. The empire would survive in name, but its heart had been cleaved in two. Though Kublai emerged victorious from the civil war, his victory could not restore the empire to its former cohesion. The Mongol world was now divided not only in geography, but in allegiance, ideology, and ambition. The great Khanates, the Yuan in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the West had begun to drift apart. Their shared ancestry no longer guaranteed loyalty, and each began to carve its own path. Kublai focused on consolidating his rule in China. He moved the capital from Karakoram to Dodu modern-day Beijing and proclaimed the beginning of the Yuan Dynasty. This act, while politically astute, symbolically distanced him from the Mongol steppe and its traditional power base. Too many Mongols, especially in the West, Kublai had become an emperor in Chinese clothing. He adopted Confucian bureaucracy, encouraged Chinese customs at court, and surrounded himself with advisors fluent in the intricacies of Han governance. The Chagatai Khanate, led by descendants of Genghis's second son Chagatai, resented this shift. Located in Central Asia, the Chagataids were caught between the influence of Persian, Islam to the west, and the old nomadic Mongol ways to the east. Internal strife plagued the Khanate, and tensions between traditionalists and those who embraced Islamic culture fractured their unity. Some rulers flirted with conversion, others resisted, and warlords gained increasing autonomy. The Ilkhanate in Persia had its own set of challenges. Though founded by Hulagu, a grandson of Genghis, who had raised Baghdad in 1258, the Ilkhans soon found themselves surrounded by Islamic civilization. Over time, the rulers themselves converted to Islam, beginning with Ghazan in the late 13th century, and the administration became increasingly Persianized. This shift alienated other Mongol elites and weakened ties with the other khanates, particularly those like the Chagatai and the Golden Horde, who remained wary of religious entanglements. The Golden Horde, centered along the Volga River, was perhaps the most independent of all. Ruled by descendants of Joki, Genghis's eldest son, it dominated the Russian steppes and collected tribute from the fledgling Russian principalities. Initially, the horde recognized the authority of the Great Khan, but as Kublai's court grew more Chinese in character, their acknowledgement became little more than ceremonial. They too would eventually convert to Islam and forge their own alliances, notably with the Mamluks of Egypt and various Eastern European states. With each khanate asserting its sovereignty, the concept of a single Mongol empire governed from one center became increasingly hollow. The title of Great Khan lingered for a time, carried by Kublai and his successors, but it held no real authority outside of Yuan China. The vast roads, trade routes, and communication networks established during the reigns of Genghis and his sons remained, but they now served a mosaic of semi-independent states rather than a single empire. Diplomatic envoys, who once addressed the emperor of all Mongols, now needed to navigate 4 different courts, each with its own language, traditions, and power structure. The legacy of Genghis lived on, but not in unity. It survived instead in fragments, in rival courts each claiming to uphold the Mongol ideal, even as they drifted further apart. The seeds of fracture had sprouted. What remained was not an empire, but a memory stitched together by bloodlines and broken promises. Part 3. The Ghost of Unity. Even as the khanates diverged, there lingered a ghost of unity that haunted the courts of Mongol rulers across the Eurasian landmass. Each successor state maintained at least a ceremonial reference to the empire their ancestors had built. Coins still bore the name of the Great Khan. Edicts sometimes opened with invocations to Genghis and his eternal blue sky. But these were echoes, not commands. Reverence had replaced obedience. Kublai's Yuan Dynasty continued to flourish, at least on the surface. His administration stabilized northern China, improved infrastructure, and promoted international trade. The empire welcomed merchants from Persia, Central Asia, and even Europe. Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler, arrived at Kublai's court and marveled at its sophistication and power. To Polo, this was the center of the world. But beneath the surface, the empire strained. Kublai's Mongol elite grew increasingly alienated from the Chinese majority. Native Chinese resented foreign rule, heavy taxes, and social hierarchies that favored Mongols and Central Asians. Rebellions simmered, and governance became an exhausting game of suppression and concession. Kublai himself, once an energetic reformer, grew old and withdrawn after the deaths of his favorite wife and heir. To the west, the Ilkhanate saw fleeting moments of prosperity. Under Ghazan and his vizier Rashid al-Din, Persia enjoyed a brief golden age of science, art, and diplomacy. Yet succession crises and internal rivalries plagued the Khanate after Ghazan's death. Within decades, it collapsed entirely, giving way to Turkic and Persian warlords, who would later be swept up in Timur's rise. The Chagatai Khanate fractured into eastern and western halves. One would be consumed by Timur's empire. The other became a breeding ground for rebellion and religious conflict. The Golden Horde, meanwhile, held firm for a time, but found itself increasingly challenged by rising powers in Eastern Europe and internal dissent. What united these stories was not governance, but memory. The Mongol Empire, once the terror of the known world, had become a legend. Its tactics were studied, its roads were used, its laws, like the Yasa, were invoked as ancient wisdom. But its unity was gone. Still, the legacy endured. The very concept of Eurasia as a connected whole, the exchange of goods and ideas across thousands of miles, was a Mongol invention. Without the conquests of Genghis and his descendants, the Silk Road would never have become the artery it was. Plague, paper, spices, and diplomacy flowed across the lands where once only nomads roamed. As the 14th century drew to a close, a new generation of conquerors in the east, the Ottomans in the west, Muscovy rising in the north, emerged to claim the world the Mongols had reshaped. The empire had died, but its bones formed the framework of a new age, The ghost of unity would never fully vanish. It would whisper in battle cries, ride with steppe warriors, echo in the dreams of men who believed they too could rule the world from horseback. Kublai Khan stood astride to civilizations. Born into the wind-swept world of the Mongol steppes, he rose to rule the teeming cities of China. The grandson of Genghis Khan, Kublai inherited more than an empire. He inherited a vision, a legacy of conquest, and a burden of unity. His reign would mark the height of Mongol grandeur and the beginning of its transformation. When Kublai assumed power, he did so in a moment of fracture. The Mongol Empire had splintered following the death of his brother Mengi, and the civil war with Baka had left deep scars. Kublai's victory had secured his place as Great Khan, but it had come at a cost: the trust and unity of the broader Mongol world. From the outset, Kublai recognized that to maintain control, he could not rely on Mongol tradition alone. The steppes had given him birth, but China would give him power. In 1271, Kublai proclaimed the foundation of the Yuan Dynasty. It was more than a name, it was a statement that the Mongol conqueror was no longer just a Khan of the nomads, but an emperor of China. He adopted the Chinese dynastic title, moved the capital to Dadu, and surrounded himself with Chinese administrators and Confucian scholars. His court became a place where Mongol, Turkic, Persian, Tibetan, and Han influences mingled, each adding a thread to the imperial tapestry. Yet Kublai never abandoned his roots. He maintained the traditional Mongol elite, kept the Yasa in force alongside Chinese laws, and preserved the privileges of Mongol aristocracy. His empire then became a hybrid creation, neither fully Chinese nor entirely Mongol. So it was a balancing act few rulers could have managed. The bureaucracy of the Yuan dynasty was vast. Kublai restructured the administration into a more centralized and hierarchical model, influenced heavily by Chinese governance, but with notable Mongol features. He implemented a four-class ethnic system: Mongols at the top, followed by Central Asians and non-Chinese foreigners, then Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese at the bottom. This hierarchy helped ensure Mongol dominance, but bred resentment and unrest among the native population. Despite the tensions, Kublai's court was a place of innovation. He introduced paper money backed by silver, expanded the postal system created under Genghis, and improved infrastructure across the empire. Roads and canals were repaired or constructed, facilitating trade and communication across vast distances. Agriculture was supported with relief measures and grain distribution during times of famine. But it was in trade and diplomacy that Kublai's genius truly shone. His empire sat at the center of a Eurasian network stretching from Venice to Vietnam. Merchants from Persia, Arabia, India, and Europe flocked to his court. Among them was the most famous traveler of the medieval world, Marco Polo. The Venetians spent nearly 2 decades in Yuan China, serving as an official and chronicler of the empire's wealth and sophistication. Through Polo's eyes, Europe would come to marvel at the splendors of the East. Kublai also cultivated relations with foreign powers. He dispatched ambassadors to Japan, Southeast Asia, and even Europe. His envoys reached the papacy and returned with Christian missionaries. Though the Mongols themselves followed a mix of religions, Tengrism, Buddhism, Islam, and Nestorian Christianity, Kublai leaned toward Tibetan Buddhism, especially in his later years, and elevated it to a privileged position within the empire. Yet, despite these successes, the challenges were mounting. China, long accustomed to its own dynastic traditions, never fully accepted the foreign rule of the Mongols. Resistance simmered beneath the surface, and uprisings flared periodically. The bureaucracy, though improved, struggled to manage the vast and diverse territories of the empire. Corruption crept in. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, and plagues added to the burden. Moreover, Kublai's attempts to expand the empire met with mixed results. He launched invasions of Japan in 1274 and again in 1281. Both failed spectacularly. The second, crushed by a typhoon that the Japanese called the kamikaze, or divine wind. His campaigns in Vietnam and Java met similar resistance and logistical failure. For the first time in Mongol history, expansion no longer brought victory, it brought frustration. Still, Kublai remained a towering figure. In a world where Mongol rule had fractured, he alone commanded a coherent, functioning state. His vision had reshaped Asia, and his court had become a beacon of multicultural exchange. The empire he ruled was no longer the lightning-fast cavalry machine of his grandfather Esserit, was something new, more complex, more fragile, and, in many ways, more ambitious. Kublai Khan ruled until 1294. In his later years, he grew heavy and reclusive, mourning the deaths of his wife Chabi and his chosen heir, Jingam. The vigor of his youth faded, replaced by melancholy. Yet, even as his health declined, his vision endured. He had taken the Mongol legacy and built an empire that touched every corner of Asia, from the Himalayan plateaus to the Pacific shores. When he died, the Yuan Dynasty remained powerful, but the cracks were deepening. Successors would struggle to hold what he had built. The unity he had fought so hard to preserve would dissolve within decades. Still, for a brief moment in history, the grandson of a steppe nomad ruled as the emperor of the largest, most diverse empire the world had ever seen. While Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty was rooted in the traditions of Chinese emperorship, it never lost the pulse of Mongol ambition. Underneath the silks of the Chinese court still beat the rhythm of hoofbeats, echoing from the steppe. Kublai's court was a paradox opulent, yet militarized, refined, yet ruthless. He had mastered the art of empire, not by conquering alone, but by integrating, innovating, and navigating the dangerous waters of competing traditions and emerging powers. At the heart of this transformation was the concept of connectivity. Kublai understood that power was no longer about simply seizing territory. It was about controlling the flows of people, goods, and ideas. He invested in rebuilding the Grand Canal, extending it to Daegu to feed the capital and move grain from the fertile south. He maintained and expanded the Yam system and intricate relay, a network of postal stations that allowed for lightning-fast communication across thousands of kilometers. This system, inherited from earlier Mongol rulers, was a marvel of logistical coordination and a crucial instrument of control. But infrastructure was only part of the story. Kublai nurtured what might be considered one of the world's earliest forms of globalization. The Silk Road, once a patchwork of perilous trails and tribal tolls, now operated under a unified imperial order. Caravans moved more safely than they had in centuries. Merchants, diplomats, and monks journeyed from Genoa and Baghdad to the gates of the Forbidden City. In the markets of Dadu, Arab coins exchanged hands alongside Chinese silk and Persian glass. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, created a rare window of stability across Eurasia, and Kublai capitalized on it masterfully. The results were astonishing. Chinese inventions such as gunpowder, printing, and the compass made their way westward, altering the course of European history. Meanwhile, Islamic astronomy, medicine, and mathematics flowed eastward, enriching Chinese science. Kublai sponsored foreign artisans, engineers, and even doctors to work in his capital. Some came voluntarily, others were coerced, but all contributed to the cosmopolitan culture of the Yuan court. And then there was Marco Polo. The young Venetian traveler arrived in China around 1275 with his father and uncle. According to his famous account, he was received warmly by Kublai and spent 17 years in service to the Khan, traveling extensively throughout the empire. While later historians have debated the accuracy of Polo's tale, its impact is undeniable. His descriptions of paper currency, porcelain, and the vast imperial administration dazzled European readers. Through Polo, the name Kublai Khan became legendary in the West, an exotic blend of barbarian warlord and enlightened monarch. Yet for all his success, Kublai could not escape the pressures that came with ruling such a vast and diverse empire. His ambitious military campaigns into Southeast Asia revealed the limits of Mongol reach. The invasion of Japan, particularly the failed 1281 expedition, was a logistical nightmare. Kublai assembled one of the largest fleets in history, over 4,000 ships carrying more than 100,000 men, but the coordination between Mongol, Korean, and Chinese forces faltered, and nature struck with devastating force. A typhoon obliterated the fleet. The samurai credited the kamikaze, the divine wind, with saving their islands. These failures bruised Kublai's prestige and bled his treasury. The war in Vietnam was another disaster. The Vietnamese employed guerrilla tactics, drawing the Mongols deep into the jungle and cutting off their supply lines. Disease, heat, and ambushes, took their toll. Though cities fell and tribute was demanded, no lasting conquest was achieved. Despite these setbacks, Kublai continued to pursue cultural consolidation within China. He promoted Buddhism, particularly Tibetan-style Lamaism, as a spiritual foundation for his rule. Tibetan monks such as Phagpa gained high status at court and played roles not only as spiritual advisors, but as political envoys. This Buddhist influence was designed to counterbalance the Confucian literati, many of whom viewed the Mongol regime as illegitimate. Kublai also commissioned massive cultural projects: histories, encyclopedias, astronomical observatories. He encouraged the translation of texts into multiple languages, including Chinese, Mongolian, Uyghur, and Tibetan. His empire, in its intellectual life, was a meeting ground of civilizations. However, tensions simmered just beneath the surface. The ethnic hierarchy he imposed alienated the Han Chinese majority. Southern Chinese, in particular, were resentful of their treatment as second-class subjects. Taxes were high, and food shortages during natural disasters led to uprisings. Some Confucian scholars withdrew from public life entirely, considering service under a foreign dynasty dishonorable. Moreover, while the court in Dadu grew ever more grandiose, the other Mongol khanats, especially the Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate, began to drift away. Kublai was still officially the Great Khan, but in reality, he wielded no authority beyond his Chinese domains. The empire of Genghis Khan, though still vast in theory, was now a federation in name only. In this environment, the grandeur of the Yuan Dynasty was both dazzling and precarious. It depended heavily on Kublai's personal authority and vision. His ministers, many of them skilled and loyal, kept the wheels of state turning, but they could not replicate his charisma, nor could they extinguish the ethnic and regional resentments that his empire had sown. As Kublai aged, the signs of decline grew clearer. Inflation from overissued paper money eroded public trust. Corruption took root in the provinces. The imperial court became insular, dominated by a few powerful families and eunuchs. Kublai's heavy reliance on foreign administrators created further rifts with native elites. Still, there was no denying that Kublai had carved out something remarkable. He had turned the Mongol Empire's raw military might into a stable, if uneasy, civilizational fusion. He had built cities, not just sacked them. He had presided over one of the most significant cultural exchanges in world history. In doing so, he had ensured that the Mongol legacy would not be written in ash and blood alone, but in ink, stone, and the whispers of scholars across continents. But legacies, like empires, are fragile. In the final years of Kublai Khan's life, the empire he had so painstakingly shaped began to slip through his fingers. Once the embodiment of Mongol vigor and adaptability, he had become old, heavy, and deeply mournful. The deaths of his beloved wife Chabi and his chosen heir Jingam cast a long shadow over his court. But even as his personal world dimmed, the Yuan dynasty glittered on the surface. The capital, Dadu, remained a marvel of imperial grandeur, ornate palaces, bustling markets, and streets filled with the polyglot hum of merchants, scholars, and soldiers. Marco Polo described it as one of the most magnificent cities he had ever seen, its scale and opulence rivaling anything in Europe or the Islamic world. Yet beneath that surface, the foundations of the empire were eroding. Kublai's policies, so effective in centralizing power and stimulating trade, could not fully contain the empire's internal contradictions. Ethnic tensions, fiscal crises, and factional infighting weakened the state's machinery. Corruption seeped into the provinces, where Mongol governors enriched themselves while local populations suffered. The economy was in particular peril. Paper money, once a revolutionary innovation under Kublai, began to lose its value. Too much had been printed to fund military expeditions and palace luxuries. Inflation spread, and public confidence in the government declined. Grain shortages exacerbated the problem, especially in the south, where Han Chinese peasants felt the burden most heavily. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, and locust plagues added to the strain. Many interpreted them as signs of heaven's displeasure. Meanwhile, Kublai's hold over the wider Mongol world was slipping. The other Khanates, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Ilkhanate, had long since ceased to recognize his authority in anything more than name. Each had their own rulers, their own agendas, and in many cases, their own faiths. Islam had become dominant in the Western Khanates, and many Mongol elites in those regions no longer looked to the Yuan court in Dadu for leadership. This fragmentation marked a profound transformation in the Mongol legacy. What had once been a unified wave of conquest was now a constellation of regional empires, loosely connected by trade and ancestry, but no longer by shared political will. Kublai's vision of imperial unity, combining steppe tradition with Chinese governance, could not survive the reality of competing ambitions and divergent cultures. Still, he tried to maintain the illusion. He surrounded himself with loyal ministers and scholars, commissioned grand historical works to legitimize his rule, and continued to receive tribute from distant vassals. But his energy was spent, as his health deteriorated. So did the momentum of the dynasty. In his final years, Kublai grew increasingly withdrawn, retreating to the pleasure palaces of Shangdu and neglecting the affairs of state. He died in 1294 at the age of 79, a remarkable age for a Mongol warrior, in a symbol of how far the empire had come from its violent birth on the steppes. Kublai's body was returned to the north, buried in a secret location, as was Mongol custom. His death marked the end of an era, the final breath of Mongol ascendancy as a world-shaping force. The Yuan dynasty would linger on for several more decades, ruled by Kublai's successors. But none possessed his charisma, his adaptability, or his political acumen. Chinese resistance movements gained strength, especially the Red Turbans, who combined millenarian religion with anti-Mongol sentiment. By the mid-14th century, the Yuan had lost control of much of the countryside. In 1368, the rebel leader Zhu Yuanzhang captured Dadu and proclaimed the founding of the Ming dynasty. The Mongols fled north, back to the steppe. The dream of ruling China had ended, yet even in defeat, the legacy of Kublai Khan endured. The Yuan had introduced new administrative practices, technological innovations, and cultural exchanges that would shape Chinese civilization for centuries. The idea of empire itself, cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, centralized, owed much to Kublai's experiment. Beyond China, the impact of his reign rippled across continents. The trade networks he fostered linked Europe and Asia more directly than ever before. Knowledge, goods, and diseases traversed the Silk Road with unprecedented speed. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the 14th century, likely followed the very trade routes that Kublai's policies had helped secure. Ironically, the same currents that enriched the Mongol Empire also carried its demand, seeded the world that would rise in its aftermath. Kublai Khan had tried to reconcile opposites, nomad and settler, conqueror and emperor, steppe and city. For a time he succeeded. His court became a mirror of the world, a place where Persian mathematicians debated with Chinese astronomers, where Tibetan monks advised Mongol generals, and where Italian adventurers dined beneath silk canopies. No other Mongol before or after him would hold such sway over so many peoples. In the long sweep of history, Kublai stands not just as a conqueror, but as a transformer, a man who took the raw, violent inheritance of Genghis Khan and reshaped it into a new vision of empire. His reign was the last great blaze of Mongol power, a flame that burned bright against the darkening sky of imperial decline. As the ashes cooled and the empires crumbled, what remained were stories of palaces that shimmered like jewels, of caravans stretching across endless deserts, of a Khan who ruled with both the sword and the scroll. In those stories, the legacy of Kublai Khan would live on not as a tyrant, not as a foreign usurper, but as one of history's great architects of civilization. The death of Kublai Khan in 1294 marked not just the end of a towering individual, but the definitive unraveling of Mongol unity. The empire that Genghis Khan had forged, one stretching unbroken from the Pacific to the Black Sea, was now splintered into separate domains. These Khanates, while still claiming allegiance to the House of Genghis, followed divergent political, cultural, and religious trajectories. What remained was not a cohesive empire, but an echo of one chorus of Khan's ruling fractured thrones. In the west, the Golden Horde ruled the vast grasslands of Russia and the steppe north of the Black and Caspian Seas. Founded by Bata Khan, Genghis's grandson, the Horde had initially exerted dominance over Russian principalities through tribute and intimidation. But by the 14th century, its grasp was weakening. The once feared cavalry had been diminished by internal feuds, Black Death outbreaks, and the rising independence of Russian states like Moscow. Though still formidable, the Golden Horde began to lose its aura of invincibility. South of the Horde in Persia and the Middle East, the Ilkhanate had been established by Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis. Following his brutal conquest of Baghdad in 1258, initially a stronghold of Mongol supremacy, the Ilkhanate had gradually morphed into a Persianized regime. Over time, the Mongol elite embraced Islam, intermarried with Persian nobility, and adopted local customs. By the early 1300s, the Ilkhanate court resembled more of a Persian sultanate than a Mongol khanate. This transformation bred both cultural richness and political tension, especially as questions arose over the legitimacy of rule in a Muslim land by a once pagan warrior lineage. To the east, the Chagatai Khanate centered in Central Asia remained the most traditionally Mongol of the successor states. Governed by descendants of Genghis Khan's second son, Chagatai, this Khanate clung to the steppe code of law and resisted the seductions of settled life longer than its siblings. However, this adherence to tradition came at a cost. The Chagatai Khanate found itself caught between the expanding Islamic world and the fading remnants of Mongol paganism. This cultural tug-of-war sparked internal divisions and set the stage for eventual fragmentation. And then there was the Yuan Dynasty in China, still claiming to be the heart of the empire, but increasingly isolated. After Kublai's death, the Yuan rulers struggled to maintain the massive bureaucracy and military structure he had built. While they held the mandate of heaven in name, in practice they were seen by many as foreign occupiers. The southern Han Chinese population remained resentful, and rebellions simmered just below the surface. Each of these khanates still referred to Genghis Khan with reverence. His name was invoked in court rituals, inscribed in chronicles, and sung by bards. But that shared ancestry was no longer enough to bind them together. The sons and grandsons of Genghis had become emperors, not brothers. They competed for glory, wealth, and legacy, often at one another's expense. The Mongol world had transitioned from a single eruptive force into 4 separate centers of power, each facing its own crises. In some ways, this was the natural evolution of empire. The Romans, too, had fractured into East and West. The Abbasids had faced similar centrifugal pressures. But for the Mongols, who had once prided themselves on their unity, their mobility, and their shared culture, the fragmentation struck at the very heart of their identity. What had once been the greatest land empire in history was now a memory held together by fragile dynasties, exhausted economies, and distant memories of conquest. And yet, the story of the Khanates was not merely one of decline. In their splintering new cultures, states and innovations would rise, each shaped by the ghost of the Mongol past. In the following parts, we will explore the decline and transformation of each major Khanate, in more detail tracing how the empire of Genghis Khan unraveled, reshaped the world in its fall, and passed its legacy on to unexpected heirs. The Ilkhanate, perhaps more than any other Mongol Khanate, embodied the transition from conquest to cultural fusion. Established in 1256 by Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, and brother of Kublai III's creation, marked the end of the Islamic Golden Age in the Middle East and the dawn of a new Mongol order. Hulagu's infamous sack of Baghdad in 1258 extinguished the Abbasid Caliphate, a defining moment in world history. Libraries were burned, mosques desecrated, and scholars slaughtered. The once gleaming capital of Islamic civilization was left in ruins. Yet within a generation, the very conquerors who brought devastation began to embrace the culture they had crushed. Successive Ilkhans adopted Persian customs, patronized Muslim scholars, and rebuilt many of the institutions their forebears had destroyed. The Persian language became dominant at court. Administrative posts were increasingly filled by Persians and Arabs, rather than steppe-born warriors. The Mongol elite, in turn, became more sedentary and cosmopolitan. They donned Persian robes, built elaborate gardens and palaces, and even dabbled in Sufi mysticism. One of the most transformative moments came under the reign of Genghis Khan. A devout Muslim, Genghis formally converted the Ilkhanate to Islam and established it as the state religion. His conversion was not a mere personal gesture. It was a sweeping realignment of the Khanate's identity. He reformed taxation, revived infrastructure, and commissioned the construction of mosques and madrasas. His reign marked a brief renaissance, during which Mongol rule in Persia seemed not only tolerable, but even productive. However, the transformation was incomplete. Deep structural problems haunted the Ilkhanate. A weak succession system, tensions between nomadic and sedentary populations, and a reliance on fragile economic ties. Ghazan's successors lacked his vision and strength. In particular, the death of Abu Said in 1335 without a clear heir plunged the Ilkhanate into chaos. Competing warlords, tribal factions, and claimants to the throne tore the Khanate apart. What followed was a patchwork of petty states and dynasties vying for control, none strong enough to reunify the region. The former heartland of the Ilkhanate fragmented into city-states and tribal confederations. Some Mongol generals set themselves up as regional rulers. Others were absorbed into Persian or Turkic polities. The disintegration was swift and irreversible. But even in collapse, the Ilkhanate left a deep imprint. Its encouragement of Persianate culture helped usher in a new era of Islamic civilization. Architecture, poetry, and science flourished, supported by local rulers who had once served the Khans. Persian miniatures, richly colored and finely detailed, often depicted scenes of Mongol court life alongside Islamic motifs. In a strange twist, the Ilkhanate's legacy was preserved not in Mongol oral tradition, but in Persian literature and Islamic historiography. Moreover, the vacuum left by the Ilkhanate's fall would open the door for one of history's most dynamic conquerors, Tamerlane, who claimed descent from the Mongols and sought to resurrect their imperial might. Though not a direct successor of Genghis Khan, Timur cast himself as the heir to Mongol glory. He would rise from the ruins of the Ilkhanate's collapse and carve out a brutal but influential empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean. In this way, the Ilkhanate's death did not end the Mongol presence in the Middle East. It mutated it. Mongol blood continued to flow through Persian dynasties. Mongol traditions were syncretized with Islamic ones. Even after the Khanate ceased to exist as a political entity, its cultural and historical presence persisted. In Iran, memories of the Ilkhans remained ambiguous, haunting and proud, destructive and civilizing. This paradox of invaders becoming patrons, destroyers becoming builders, would characterize many parts of the post-Mongol world. And in Persia, where the scars of Mongol conquest were deepest, the transformation was most profound. The twilight of the Ilkhanate was not a final darkness, but a dusk before new stars rose over the Islamic world. Of all the Mongol successor states, the Golden Horde maintained its identity the longest, both as a Mongol power and as a shaper of regional history. Founded in the mid-13th century by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and leader of the Western campaigns, the Horde established its dominance over a vast swath of Eurasia from the Volga River to the Carpathian Mountains. For over a century, it ruled the Russian principalities, exacted tribute from Eastern Europe, and struck fear into the heart of Christendom. Yet by the 14th century, the Golden Horde was a giant teetering on brittle legs. Its center of power lay along the Volga River, in cities like Sarai Batu and later Sarai Burk. These urban hubs were thriving cosmopolitan trade centers, linking China, the Middle East, and Europe. The Horde controlled a portion of the Silk Road, and its tolerance for multiple religions, Islam, Orthodox Christianity, Buddhism, and shamanism, allowed it to manage a diverse population. Despite this, internal contradictions were mounting. The Horde, like its sibling Khanates, had become more sedentary and bureaucratic. This evolution brought both administrative gains and cultural dilution. Rivalries among descendants of Jochi, Genghis Khan's eldest son, frequently ignited civil wars. Plagues ravaged the population, and nomadic military superiority began to erode against rising settled powers. One of the most fateful developments came from within its own tributary system, the slow, patient ascent of Moscow. Initially just one among many Russian city-states subjugated by the Mongols, Moscow had learned to thrive under Mongol rule. Its princes mastered the art of diplomacy, using tribute to curry favor with the Khans and to undermine their rivals in places like Tver and Novgorod. The Muscovite rulers, especially Ivan I Khalida, earned the title of Grand Prince by proving themselves the most loyal and effective tax collectors for the Horde. Ironically, it was this very loyalty that allowed Moscow to accumulate power. With the Khans distracted by internal strife, Muscovite rulers built alliances, fortified cities, and expanded influence. They began to position themselves not as servants of the horde, but as rightful heirs to the Rus. By the late 14th century, the balance was shifting. The most decisive blow came at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. There, the Muscovite prince, Dmitry Donskoy, led a coalition of Russian forces against the horde general Mamai. Though the Mongols would retaliate soon after, Kulikovo became a symbol of Russian resistance and a crack in the wall of Mongol dominance. Even so, the Golden Horde endured into the 15th century. Its rulers converted to Islam and maintained control of lucrative trade routes along the steppe. But it was now a power in retreat. The rise of Timur's empire in the south and Ottoman dominance in the west further hemmed in its ambitions. The ultimate undoing of the Golden Horde came not through a cataclysmic defeat but through fragmentation. By the mid-1400s, it had split into smaller Khanats Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, and Siberia, struggling to assert independence while clinging to the Mongol legacy. These successor states retained elements of Mongol governance and identity, but they were pale shadows of the horde that had once thundered into Europe. And as these Khanates withered, Moscow surged. Under Ivan III and later Ivan IV, Russia would cast off the yoke of Mongol tribute altogether. The Kremlin, once the seat of a minor principality, became the heart of a resurgent Russian state. In a powerful historical irony, the Mongol yoke had shaped the rise of Russia as much as it had subdued it. The centralization of power, the creation of a standing army, even the autocratic style of rule all bore the imprint of the horde. Thus, the Golden Horde's twilight was not just a story of decay, but of transformation. It passed its torch willingly to its former tributaries. And through those successors, the legacy of the Mongol Empire continued to ripple into the modern world. The conquest of China was no easy feat. It took the Mongols more than 6 decades to bring the sprawling, fractured Chinese realm under their control. From the Jin Dynasty in the north to the Song Dynasty in the south, the Mongols faced not just massive armies and fortified cities, but also the inertia of one of the most ancient and bureaucratic civilizations on Earth. Yet Genghis Khan had set his sights on the rich lands of the East from the beginning. His campaigns against the Jin Dynasty in northern China laid the foundation for what would become the most transformative Mongol conquest. The fall of Zhengdu in 1215 marked a brutal turning point. The Mongols employed their now infamous siege tactics, battering city walls with Chinese engineers they had captured and conscripted from earlier campaigns. Once inside, they enacted ruthless reprisals intended both to break resistance and to send a message. But the heart of the Chinese conquest beat strongest in the campaigns of Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson and one of the most fascinating rulers in world history. Where Genghis was the destroyer, Kublai sought to be a builder. After a series of bloody campaigns that culminated in the fall of the Song Dynasty in 1279, Kublai unified China under Mongol rule for the first time in its long history. He declared himself emperor of the Yuan Dynasty, adopting a Chinese dynastic name to lend legitimacy to his foreign rule. This was an unprecedented move. No nomadic conqueror had ever managed to subdue all of China, let alone rule it as a Chinese emperor. Kublai was no mere warlord. He was a statesman of vision, one who understood that brute force alone could not hold China together. He moved the Mongol capital from Karakoram to Dadu, transforming it into a cosmopolitan hub of empire. Massive building projects followed: canals, granaries, roads, palaces, and the reconstruction of the Grand Canal. Dadu became one of the largest and most sophisticated cities on Earth. Yet Kublai's reign was more than just infrastructural prowess. He promoted trade, welcomed foreign merchants like Marco Polo, and built an empire that stretched from Korea to the gates of Vietnam. His court became a melting pot of ideas and languages. Persian scribes, Nestorian priests, Tibetan lamas, and Muslim astronomers worked alongside Chinese officials. The Silk Road flourished, linking the East with the West in ways never before seen. However, this cosmopolitan grandeur masked deeper tensions. Kublai, despite his efforts to appear as a Chinese emperor, remained a foreign ruler. The Mongol elite clung to their own customs and enjoyed privileges far above those of the native Han Chinese. A rigid caste hierarchy placed Mongols at the top, followed by Central Asians and Muslims, then northern Chinese, and finally southern Chinese at the bottom. This fueled resentment that simmered beneath the surface of Yuan rule. Moreover, the sheer scale of the empire bred administrative complexity. The Yuan Dynasty imported bureaucratic systems from China, but modified them with Mongol oversight. Military governors ruled vast provinces. Corruption festered in the layers between Mongol overlords and Chinese administrators. And while the Mongols encouraged religious diversity, they were also wary of the Confucian scholars, who had long been the backbone of Chinese governance. Still, for a brief moment in history, Kublai Khan stood as master of the most populous and cultured nation on earth. He had realized a dream that had eluded countless conquerors before him. The Mongols were no longer outsiders to China, they were its rulers. And under Kublai, they did not merely rule by force. They ruled with vision, wealth, and a staggering ambition to make China the heart of a new world empire. But empires built on contradictions often collapse under their own weight. And as Kublai aged and died, the Yuan dynasty would soon find itself beset by the very challenges that had always threatened it. Native rebellion, bureaucratic rot, and the difficulty of balancing two incompatible worlds, nomadic and sedentary, Mongol and Chinese. The Yuan dynasty, born of conquest and held together by charisma, military strength, and an uneasy fusion of cultures, began to falter in the decades following Kublai Khan's death in 1294. His successors, though claiming the title of Great Khan, lacked the strategic brilliance, diplomatic finesse, and administrative acumen of their forebear. The unity Kublai had forged between the Mongol conquerors and their Chinese subjects was fragile, and it began to crack. At the heart of the Yuan collapse was a crisis of leadership. In the 40 years after Kublai's death, the dynasty saw 9 emperors rise and fall. Many were placed on the throne as puppets by powerful court factions or military strongmen. Assassinations, coups, and factional infighting plagued the court at Dadu. The imperial government, once efficient under Kublai's centralized system, now became riddled with corruption and cronyism. Governors ruled with impunity, and Mongol nobles grew increasingly indifferent to the challenges of governing a sedentary empire. Meanwhile, the empire's economic foundations were eroding. Heavy taxation, especially on the southern Chinese, who had long borne the brunt of Mongol distrust, sparked widespread resentment. The empire's massive construction projects and extravagant court expenses drained state coffers. Floods and famines, particularly along the Yellow River, devastated farmlands and displaced millions. Relief efforts were slow, uneven, or altogether absent. For the peasantry, life under the Yuan began to feel less like imperial protection and more like foreign oppression. As suffering grew, so did unrest. Banditry spread through the countryside, and local militias, often led by former soldiers or Buddhist monks, began to defy imperial authority. One of the most infamous of these movements was the Red Turban Rebellion, which began in the 1350s. Its roots lay in a secretive, millenarian Buddhist sect known as the White Lotus Society, which preached the coming of a new age and the expulsion of foreign rulers. Combining religious fervor with social grievance, the Red Turbans quickly mobilized thousands. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Whole provinces fell under rebel control. Mongol garrisons were overrun or deserted. As chaos grew, competing warlords seized the moment to carve out their own fiefdoms. One of them, a peasant monk's son named Zhu Yuanzheng, would become the most significant. Zhu was a formidable leader, ruthless and politically astute. He joined the Red Turbans early, but soon established his own faction and began eliminating rivals. Unlike many rebel leaders, Zhu understood both the military and ideological stakes of his campaign. He positioned himself not merely as a warlord, but as the restorer of Chinese order. His proclamations invoked Confucian ideals, the mandate of heaven, and the need to end Mongol misrule. By the 1360s, Zhu's forces had seized Nanjing, which he declared his base of operations. He reorganized his administration, cultivated alliances with scholars and bureaucrats, and built a disciplined army. In 1368, after years of campaigning, Zhu marched north. The Yuan emperor, unable to rally enough support or defend the capital, fled Dadu. The Mongol court retreated to the steppe, and Dadu fell without a major siege. With that, the Yuan dynasty was no more. Zhu Yuanzhang proclaimed the founding of the Ming Dynasty, marking a dramatic return to Han Chinese rule after nearly a century of foreign dominance. He became known as the Hongwu Emperor, one of China's most significant founders. Yet the Mongols were not entirely vanquished. The retreating Yuan court established what became known as the Northern Yuan, a rump state based in Mongolia proper. Though they no longer controlled China, these Mongols continued to claim legitimacy as emperors and launched periodic raids into Chinese territory. The Ming, for their part, built a strong military frontier including portions of what would later become the Great Wall to defend against their former overlords. The Yuan's collapse had far-reaching consequences. It shaped Chinese perceptions of foreign rule for centuries to come, entrenching xenophobic and isolationist sentiments. It also set the tone for the Ming dynasty's assertive, often paranoid governance. But even in defeat, the Yuan left deep marks on China. Mongol influence could be seen in military organization, postal systems, religious tolerance, and the multi-ethnic composition of the Chinese Empire. Ironically, while they were ousted as rulers, they had helped shape the very foundations of the dynasty that replaced them. The fall of the Yuan was not just a political change, it was a cultural reckoning. China had absorbed its conquerors, resisted their dominance, and then repurposed parts of their legacy. As always, the empire did not forget, but it evolved. Though the Yuan dynasty's fall in 1368 marked the end of Mongol rule over China, it did not signal the end of Mongol imperial ambition. The remnants of the dynasty, now called the Northern Yuan, retreated beyond the Great Wall to the Mongolian steppes. Yet the memory of the empire was a powerful rallying cry. Genghis Timur, also known as Bela Khan, was among the most prominent of the early northern Yuan rulers. He maintained court rituals, imperial titles, and diplomatic missions that echoed the grandeur of the former Yuan. His successors continued to refer to themselves as emperors, not Khans, a symbolic declaration that their rule was not regional but universal. Throughout the 15th century, waves of conflict erupted between the Ming and the Northern Yuan. The Mongols launched numerous raids into northern China, some of which reached deep into the heartland. In 1449, in a stunning reversal, Mongol forces under Esen Taishi captured the Ming Emperor Jukizian in what became known as the Tumu Crisis. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the tide of history might turn once more in favor of the Mongols. But internal divisions prevented any lasting revival. The Mongols remained fractured into various factions: the Eastern Mongols, the Oirets in the west, and local tribal leaders with competing interests. The once unified empire had become a web of rival claims and mutual distrust. Without a strong central figure to replicate Genghis Khan's unifying charisma, the dream of restoring the Yuan remained just that, a dream. Over time, Mongol influence waned. The Ming dynasty consolidated its northern frontier, constructing and expanding massive fortifications, some of which would become part of the Great Wall of China. Trade with the Mongols was strictly regulated, and diplomatic channels became sporadic or hostile. By the 17th century, the northern Yuan had faded into regional obscurity. Yet the legacy of the Mongols persisted in surprising ways. In Tibet, for example, Mongol patronage helped elevate the power of the Dalai Lama, creating a religious political bond that would last for centuries. To the Ming and Qing dynasties, the Yuan era was both a cautionary tale and a moment of transformation. On one hand, it symbolized the dangers of foreign conquest. On the other, it left behind administrative innovations, military lessons, and cultural exchanges that shaped China's imperial future. In modern times, the Yuan Dynasty has undergone a re-evaluation. Chinese historians increasingly view it not as an aberration, but as one of the legitimate dynasties in the Chinese imperial tradition. The Yuan's contributions to trade, astronomy, and art are now recognized as part of China's broader historical tapestry. Meanwhile, in Mongolia, the legacy of the Northern Yuan became central to national identity. During the 20th century, Mongolian nationalists embraced Genghis Khan and his successors as symbols of unity and pride. The ruins of Karakoram were studied and preserved. All the old imperial banners once trampled into obscurity were raised again in spirit. Ultimately, the Yuan dynasty's afterlife was not about power, but memory. Though its empire crumbled, its vision endured. The Mongols had ruled the greatest land empire in human history, spanning from the Pacific to the heart of Europe. They had governed China, reshaped Asia, and opened pathways of trade and cultural exchange that would echo through the ages. The Northern Yuan could not recapture that glory, but they ensured it would not be forgotten. History has seen many conquerors, but few have left footprints as wide or as deep as Genghis Khan. His death in 1227 did not mark the end of Mongol expansion. It marked a transition from the man to the machine. What Genghis had created was not merely a kingdom or even an empire. It was a world order, a seismic shift in the global balance of power, one that redrew maps, rewrote laws, and rerouted the currents of civilization. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had become the largest contiguous land empire in history. Stretching from the Pacific shores of Korea and China across Central Asia into Russia, the Middle East, and deep into Eastern Europe. It covered more than 24 million square kilometers, encompassing over 100 million people. But its true reach was not just territorial, it was civilizational. Wherever Mongol armies rode, they left behind more than ashes. Yes, their initial conquests were often terrifying. Cities razed, populations slaughtered, orders shattered. But once the dust settled, the Mongols built. They imposed law and order on a chaotic and fractious world. Roads were cleared, bandits were eliminated, and trade routes reopened. The result was what historians call the Pax Mongolica, century-long period of relative peace and stability across Eurasia that enabled unprecedented cultural and commercial exchange. The Mongols connected east and west in ways never seen before. The Silk Road, once a perilous journey fraught with tribal raids and unpredictable tolls, became a secure highway for merchants, missionaries, scholars, and diplomats. Spices, silk, gunpowder, and porcelain traveled westward. Glass, silver, medicine, and ideas flowed east. Under the Mongols, a Persian astronomer could teach in a Chinese observatory, and an Italian merchant like Marco Polo could find employment in the court of the Great Khan. Crucially, the Mongols were cultural syncretists. Unlike many conquerors, they did not seek to impose their religion, art, or language on others. Instead, they elevated local talent and integrated the strengths of their subject peoples. Chinese engineers helped build siege weapons. Persian bureaucrats ran tax systems. Arab doctors staffed imperial hospitals. The empire, though ruled by Mongols, was administrated by the best minds from a dozen civilizations. This pragmatic openness extended to religion. Genghis Khan and his successors practiced a form of religious tolerance that was radical for its time. Mosques, temples, and churches stood side by side in Mongol cities. Christian monks debated Buddhist lamas. Muslim imams taught in Chinese cities. The Mongols believed that the divine spoke many tongues, and they made room for them all. But the empire's impact was not merely ideological, it was also technological. Paper money, first introduced in China, spread west under Mongol patronage. So did innovations in printing, navigation, and warfare. The Mongols revolutionized logistics, creating relay stations across thousands of miles, allowing messengers to cross Asia in weeks rather than months. The idea of a centralized postal network so commonplace today traces back to these wind-swept stations guarded by Mongol riders. Yet perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. The Mongols shattered the myth of permanence. Cities like Baghdad, long seen as eternal, were destroyed in days. Ruling dynasties that traced their lineage for centuries vanished in a generation. The Mongols demonstrated that nothing was immune to conquest. Not walls, not empires, not ideas. Europe, in particular, was deeply shaken. Though the Mongols never conquered the continent, their raids into Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans exposed the fragility of European kingdoms. Chroniclers described them as the scourge of God, and some believe the apocalypse had arrived. In their wake, European states began to rethink defense, diplomacy, and even theology. Ironically, it was this fear that also opened doors. In the 13th century, European envoys traveled to Mongol courts hoping for alliances against mutual enemies. Along with them came knowledge of Asia, its riches, and its peoples. These early encounters would centuries later inspire the age of exploration. In short, Genghis Khan and his descendants did more than redraw maps. They restructured the connective tissue of the world. They shrank the globe long before planes and satellites. They made it possible for a monk in Venice to pray for a friend in Beijing, or a merchant in Samarkand to sell goods in Cairo. The Mongol Empire was the first truly global empire. And Genghis Khan, the man who forged it from the winds of the steppe, was more than a conqueror. He was an architect of the modern world. For all its connectivity, cultural exchange, and geopolitical innovation, the Mongol Empire came at a staggering human cost. The legacy of Genghis Khan is as much written in blood and fire as it is in trade and tolerance. Behind the stories of peace on the Silk Road lie the mountains of skulls, the razed cities, and the silence of entire civilizations that never recovered. The Mongol approach to warfare was ruthless by design. Terror was not a byproduct of conquest. It was a strategic weapon. From the outset, Genghis Khan understood that fear could win battles long before the first arrow was loosed. Cities that resisted were made into cautionary tales. Those that surrendered often survived, but those that fought back were annihilated. Historians estimate that the Mongol conquests may have resulted in 40 to 60 million deaths, a staggering toll in a world with a much smaller population. The city of Nishapur was reportedly depopulated after a Mongol siege. Merv, once one of the largest cities in the world, saw its population slaughtered in a single day. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic Golden Age, fell in 1258 to Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulaguand, with it. So did a millennium of scholarship, culture, and civilization. The Mongols destroyed irrigation systems in Persia and Mesopotamia, leading to the long-term degradation of fertile lands. In some regions, the demographic scars of Mongol conquest are still visible centuries later. The psychological trauma was even deeper. Poets, chroniclers, and survivors describe the Mongols in apocalyptic terms: demons from the steppe. The black wind, the punishment of heaven. This brutality wasn't mindless. Genghis Khan and his generals believed that decisive, overwhelming violence would reduce resistance over time. It often did. But the sheer scale of destruction raised ethical questions even in their own era. Muslim historians in particular grappled with how to understand this catastrophe. Was it divine punishment? Was it chaos incarnate? Or was it somehow part of a grander historical cycle? To complicate matters, the Mongols also preserved as much as they destroyed. In many cases, they spared artisans, engineers, and scholars. Entire populations were relocated to serve the empire. Chinese siege engineers were moved to the Middle East. Persian doctors were sent to China. Russian blacksmiths found themselves forging armor for Mongol lords. This movement of people sometimes saved lives, but it also stripped regions of their cultural lifeblood. The Mongols also contributed to one of the darkest biological episodes in human history. It was along the trade routes they secured, especially the Silk Road and maritime networks, that the Black Death began to spread in the mid-14th century, though they didn't cause the plague. Mongol unification of Eurasia enabled the disease to move swiftly from China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. Tens of millions would die, reshaping societies across continents. Meanwhile, the Mongol legal system, known as the Yasa, was draconian in its punishments. Theft was met with death, treason even more so. Though the Yasa helped create internal stability and a code of honor among steppe warriors, It often clashed with local legal traditions and systems of justice. Subject peoples lived under the constant threat of reprisal not only from the empire's armies but from its laws. The environmental cost of the Mongol expansion is also seldom discussed. As steppe horses grazed across conquered lands, agricultural zones were trampled. Forests were cleared to feed fires and supply timber. Nomadic military logistics, which required vast pastures for tens of thousands of horses, reshaped entire landscapes. The ecology of Central Asia and northern China changed under the pressures of a mounted empire. Yet perhaps the most lasting darkness was the legacy of fear. In Russia, the Mongol occupation known as the Tatar yoke created a cultural trauma that influenced the region's politics for centuries. The centralization of power under Muscovy, the suspicion of foreigners, and the valorization of strong, autocratic rulers all bear traces of the Mongol imprint. In the Middle East, the destruction of Baghdad marked the symbolic end of the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars fled. Institutions collapsed. The House of Wisdom, once the greatest library in the world, was allegedly thrown into the Tigris River, its ink turning the waters black for days. Even in China, where the Mongols ruled for nearly a century, resentment festered. The Yuan Dynasty was never fully accepted by the Han Chinese majority. After its fall, the Ming Dynasty would attempt to purge Mongol influence, reinforcing Confucian, orthodoxy, and building massive walls to prevent another northern incursion. None of this erases the achievements of the Mongols, but it balances the narrative. Genghis Khan was not merely a great unifier, he was also a destroyer. His genius was paired with brutality. His vision with violence, the empire he created, brought the world closer together, but often at terrible cost. To understand Genghis Khan is to embrace this paradox. He was both a world builder and a world burner. The storm that shaped the world also scorched it. Centuries have passed since Genghis Khan's final breath on the steppes of Mongolia, but his presence has never faded. In fact, the memory of the great Khan has only grown reshaped, reinterpreted and repurposed by generations across cultures and continents. From the dusty scrolls of Persian chroniclers to the towering equestrian statue that now overlooks the Mongolian plains, Genghis Khan endures, not just as a figure of history, but as a living force in identity, myth, and power. Mongolia, he is not simply remembered. He is revered. Streets, schools, airports, and banks bear his name. His profile is emblazoned on currency. And in the hearts of many Mongolians, he remains the father of the nation, the one who gave them a place in history, a voice among giants, and a legacy unlike any other. This revival is not accidental. After centuries of being demonized by outsiders and, later downplayed during Mongolia's communist era, Genghis Khan was resurrected in the 1990s as a symbol of national pride. Following the fall of Soviet influence, Mongolians began a cultural and historical reclamation. Genghis Khan emerged at the center, not as a barbarian or conqueror, but as a visionary leader, unifier, and lawgiver. In 2008, a 40-meter-high stainless steel statue of Genghis Khan was unveiled east of Ulaanbaatar. The figure, stern and majestic, looks out over the steppe where he was born, mounted atop a war horse, a golden whip in hand. Beneath it lies a visitor center that tells his story, his rise from orphaned outcast to emperor of emperors. It is a pilgrimage site, a place where modern Mongolians come to connect with the eternal spirit of the Kagan. But Genghis Khan's legacy extends far beyond Mongolia's borders. In China, he is commemorated as a historical figure who helped unify territories and laid the groundwork for later dynasties. The Inner Mongolian Autonomous Region holds ceremonies in his honor, and Chinese schoolbooks present him as a part of their long imperial narrative. In Russia, particularly among Turkic and Mongol-descended peoples in regions like Buryatia and Tatarstan, he is both ancestor and cultural hero. In Central Asia, his memory intertwines with tribal genealogies and legends of warrior kings. In the West, he remains a subject of fascination, a ruthless general to some, military genius to others, and a cautionary tale of power and ambition. Popular media has further shaped this image. Novels, documentaries, and films have cast Genghis Khan as everything from a misunderstood hero to a global menace. In literature, he's a symbol of raw willpower, of destiny seized by force. In historical discourse, he is frequently ranked among the most influential individuals in human history. His name evokes awe and debate in equal measure. Yet the historical Genghis Khan is elusive. His tomb remains undiscovered, hidden somewhere in the Mongolian wilderness. Legend claims that his funeral escort killed everyone they met on the road to keep the location secret. Some stories say rivers were diverted and forests planted to conceal the site forever. Archaeologists have searched for decades, but the great emperor still sleeps in silence. Untouched by time, his grave is mysterious as his mind. What does this enduring presence tell us? That Genghis Khan is not just a relic of the past? He is a mirror in which every generation sees something different. The liberator, the tyrant, the innovator, the destroyer, the father of a nation, the scourge of civilization. He embodies one of history's greatest paradoxes, a man born in a felt tent with no written language, who built an empire that connected half the world. A warrior who killed millions, yet fostered trade and religious tolerance. A man whose story begins in obscurity and ends in eternity. In modern Mongolia, children still learn about Genghis Khan not as a legend, but as a source of identity. His spirit is invoked in political speeches, cultural festivals, and national holidays. He is not frozen in time, he lives in the present, guiding a people who once ruled the world and now seek their place in it once more. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Genghis Khan, not merely what he conquered, but what he created in memory. A name that refuses to die. A vision that reshaped the planet. Storm that, though long past, still echoes across the earth.
Peace.
And always will be the eternal Khan.